live, or not live, but anyhow, being recorded. Um, it is also being live streamed on YouTube, so just to let you know about that. And we're going to start today's meeting with a land acknowledgement that's led by Christina.
Thank you, Gordon. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is now within the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty.
Great, thank you. The project that we're going to be reviewing first this afternoon is 100 Borough Drive. It's the first time it's come before the panel. And this is an official plan and zoning bylaw amendment application, as well as the first review of this project. We've set aside an hour and 25 minutes to do the review, and a vote will be taken at the end of the agenda. The staff will have 10 minutes to make the presentation. After that, the applicant or proponent team will have a 15-minute presentation. In both cases, when there's 1 minute left in your time, I'll gently butt in and let you know that you have a minute left. And then we'll have panel discussion, questions of clarification, and then panel discussion following that. And again, the session is being live streamed on YouTube and is also being recorded. And that recording will be available on the City Planning YouTube channel following the meeting. So what I'm going to do now is move on to the panel roll call. And panel members, as I call your name, if you can just let me know that you're here and let me know whether you have any conflict of interest. I'm going to start with Dima.
No conflict.
Thank you, Dima. Juhi? Is Juhi here? No, I'll move on.
See her.
Beg your pardon?
I don't see her.
You don't see her. Okay, great. Thank you. Heather?
Here and no conflict.
Thanks, Heather. Jim Melvin?
Here and no conflict.
Thank you, Jim. And Jim Goff?
Here and no conflict.
Thank you, Jim. Joe?
Here, no conflict.
Thanks, Joe. Ralph?
Here and no conflict.
Thank you. Olivia?
Here, no conflict.
Thanks, Olivia. Anna?
Here, no conflict.
And Aladia?
Here and no conflict.
Thanks, Aladia. Okay, and just swinging back to Juhi, I'm assuming that she's left the meeting. Is that correct, Leanne?
I don't think she attended, sorry.
Okay, that's great. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the city staff introduction and presentation. Again, you have a total of 10 minutes. The 9-minute mark, I'll gently butt in to give you that 1 minute notice. As soon as you're ready, we'll begin.
Great, thanks, Gordon.
Okay. Okay.
Everyone can see the first slide?
Yep, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Well, good afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Kelly Dines, Senior Planner in the Scarborough District, and here with me today is Sasha Terry, Senior Urban Designer. We are here today to discuss the redevelopment of 100 Borough Drive, outlined in red on the map on the left-hand side. The site is currently home to a vacant 6-story office building and associated surface parking. Up until a few years ago, it had been occupied by Bell Canada, which is how we currently refer to the site, the Bell Canada site. South of the site is the SRT corridor and Triton Road. Sorry, the site is south of the SRT corridor and Triton Road. Borough Drive wraps around the west and south limits for a total of about just over 200 meters of frontage, and Brian Harrison Way abuts the lands to the east and ends in a cul-de-sac. Vehicular access is currently from Brian Harrison Way. There are a number of trees on the site or within 6 meters of the site, including a remnant woodlot forest along the southern edge of the property. SRT infrastructure, you can see the picture in the bottom right, runs along the northern portion of the site. The SRT was decommissioned in July 2023, and we're currently running bus services until the Scarborough subway opens. So the photo on the top right on the previous slide and this slide provide a bird's eye view of the building in situ, as well as the adjacent Scarborough Civic Center, Albert Campbell Square, and the Civic Green and Library. Northeast of the site are, and at the top of Brian Harrison Way, are two 37-story condos. East of the site is the Scarborough Civic Center, jointly owned by the city and TDSB. West is a 35-story condos and 4-story townhouses. And south of the site, on the south side, just off of this map, is the Frank Faubert Woodlot and Hand of God Park. The Bell Canada building is representative of the late modernist architectural style, constructed in 1978 by Short, Tilby, Henschel, and Irwin Peters. It's listed on the city's Heritage Register through Delegated Listing Authority. The Bell Canada building relates to the Scarborough Civic Center in plan view as a geometric pinwheel form responding to the irregular shape of the lot and the geometric pyramidal form of the Scarborough Civic Center. Additional design geometries can be seen in Albert Campbell Square with its radiating paving patterns, the Federal Building, and the blue canopy you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And while not seen in this photo, there's also a water-free feature within Albert Campbell Square that demonstrates the same triangular cascading form. Recent additions also include the Civic Green, which is just sort of in the middle of the property, and the rooftop of the Scarborough Center Library, which also continue this geometric landscape. Staff are recommending design commemoration of the building with the proposed new redevelopment. This slide just provides some additional views surrounding the site. So the top left is a view from the subject site looking north, and then a view looking east at the TDSB portion of the Scarborough Civic Center. Bottom right is looking across Borough Drive at the existing condo and townhouses. And here we see an important view from the intersection of Borough Drive and Brian Harrison Way to the actual building itself. The Scarborough Center is currently undergoing significant development intensification, mostly triggered by the future subway coming to the center. The existing and emerging context surrounding the site demonstrates significant change in density that is coming. This slide highlights a few of the key developments in and around the application, particularly number 5 and 6, which are two Housing Now applications. Number 4 represents the entirety of the Oxford properties. There's a recent settlement that includes 35 towers, resulting in approximately 15,000 plus future dwelling units. I think I might just skip over this slide because I know the applicant will be talking about their specific application. As Gordon mentioned, it's an OPA and a rezoning, 3 blocks with 5 towers, just over 2,000 residential dwelling units, public park, and a public street. Planning policies that guide the site. Scarborough Center is one of 4 growth centers in Toronto, as outlined on the map in blue. Centers are where we expect excellent transit accessibility and absorption of population and employment growth. Most of the centers designated mixed use, including the subject site, which permit a broad range of residential, commercial, and institutional uses. The site is zoned City Center Residential and City Center Town Square Zone, which permit all residential dwelling units and some commercial uses. So within the site, within Scarborough Center, we've seen significant investment in the form of transit and associated development pressure, and staff have been working on updating the Scarborough Center secondary plan. We expect to take draft policies out later this year or early next year with a final staff report next year. Sasha?
So our Scarborough Center public realm plan, it envisions a central east-west 20-meter right-of-way neighborhood public street that connects to the existing public realm framework of Brian Harrison Way and Albert Campbell Square. We're also looking at a southerly on-site public park that protects the remnant woodlot along Borough Drive, a northerly SRT POPs, a commemoration of the SRT land in the form of a POPs is envisioned, and a central north-south POPs mid-block connection that connects the public and private landscapes to Frank Faubert Woodlot Trail to the south. Next slide. Our Scarborough Centre study also gives guidance to protecting sunlight on important urban squares, parks, and natural features within the Scarborough Centre. Albert Campbell Square is a community focal point and urban square for Scarborough Centre, which includes seating areas, park areas, and an amphitheater which hosts community events during the day and the evening. 7 hours of free of incremental shadow are recommended for protection of sunlight on Albert Campbell Square, which fronts the Civic Centre between 11:18 and 6:18 p.m. during the spring and fall equinox. Next slide. The current proposal reduces sunlight on Albert Campbell Square from 7 hours to 5 hours due to 2 hours of shadow impact from 4:18 to 6:18 p.m. The southerly block towers are more impactful. The southerly block towers cast shadows throughout the square between 4:18 and 6:18 p.m. Northerly block towers cast shadows on the northern portion of the square at 6:18 p.m. Next slide. So the current our Scarborough building height strategy directs tallest heights to 3 emerging height peaks: a height peak at the subway station, a height peak along the 401, and a height peak at Brimley and Progress. Heights between the height peaks are to transition down in height to define the height peaks and fit within their existing height context. This site is located outside the Brimley height peak and has an existing height context of 37 stories, residential condominium to the east, and 35 stories to the west, as well as 41 stories to the north. Staff's position is that the site should not exceed 40 stories at the northern block and should transition down in height from north to south to fit within the existing tower context and limit shadow impact on Albert Campbell Square. Next slide. So due to staff's concern with a lack of connected landscape open space at grade, a lack of mix of building types, and concern of shadow impact on Albert Campbell Square, staff have provided a design alternative to the applicant. The design alternative includes shifting the public road approximately 50 meters south to relocate a tower from the south block to the north block, allowing for additional landscape open space at grade and a mid-rise building in the south block. An SRT POPs is proposed in the north block, which is linked to the public street and public park through a north-south POPs walkway in line with direction of our Scarborough Centre. The design alternative steps the building height down from the north to the south, reducing the amount of towers and tower height in the southern block, designed to reduce shadow impact on Albert Campbell Square. Due to the existing SRT infrastructure and outstanding council direction on the future of the SRT, the feasibility of Tower B proposed by the applicant at the top right-hand corner is unknown at this point.
Sasha, you have about a minute left. Is that going to be okay?
That's perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide. So staff are seeking the panel's advice on the following issues: the public realm network and build form impact, including shadows in Albert Campbell Square, tower heights, building types and transition in relation to our Scarborough Centre study, and heritage and SRT commemoration. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on now to the consultant team presentation. We'll just give you a moment to get it up on the screen. And while you're doing that, I'll just mention again, you have 15 minutes total, 14-minute mark. I will remind you that you have a minute left. And the floor is yours.
You see my screen okay?
I can, yes.
Great, thanks. My name is David Mackay. I'm a registered professional planner with MHBC. With me from my office is Greg Costa, our landscape architect, and Shadi Adab, our urban designer. And Henry, do you want to introduce your team?
Sure. My name is Henry Bursted. I'm a principal at Arcadis Architects. I'm here with Daniel Hirsch and Savash as well.
Thanks very much. So a lot of our slide presentation at the beginning is somewhat repetitive of what staff have said, so I'm going to quickly move through these slides. As staff had mentioned, the site is located in the Scarborough Town Centre. Is currently occupied with an older office building that is currently vacant. It is designated mixed use as noted by staff as well. Obviously, the site in yellow is shown here. One item to clarify is that the SRT along the northern portion of the site is located on the property and not adjacent to it. So it is part of the property and is scheduled to be removed as per a legal agreement with the city and TTC. So these are just some views of the site from different angles. You can see the various developments that have occurred over the last 20 to 30 years surrounding the site, and then some photos of the site and surrounding area at grade. There are a series of easements across the property. A number of them are in favor of the City of Toronto and will be relocated or removed as part of the redevelopment, and others in favor of private development, which we also can remove through legal means and per the agreements with those entities. So in terms of staff have mentioned this, there are a series of development applications anticipated and in progress as part of the redevelopment of Scarborough Town Center and surrounding area in relation to the future subway extension to the area. This site is within 800 meters of the future subway stop, so within the MTSA as per provincial guidance. Obviously, as part of the development of the area, a series of existing parks will remain, and future parks are planned, including on the subject lands at the south end, which we'll get into in more detail. Obviously, very well connected in terms of transit and as well as vehicular movements through the area, which again we'll link into and Henry will talk to in more detail. And obviously, the pedestrian network as well. And services are plenty in this area. This is the proposal in context of the massing studies that have been submitted for the surrounding area, similar to the demonstration plan shown by staff. The proposal is in the dark green at the bottom of the image. In terms of the building itself, a heritage study was undertaken by our firm, which determined that while it did meet 2 of the 9 criteria under the Heritage Act, it was not worthy of preservation, and staff have recognized that and through the commemoration aspects and requests through the application. Henry, I'll pass it over to you to talk about the site design.
Sure. Maybe you could switch to the larger site plan, David?
Yes, there you go.
Thanks so much. So thank you, everyone. And I think David did a great job basically outlining the fact that this site is really has an incredible amount of infrastructure, close walking distance to transit, shopping, parks, and other significant investments. And that's what our site plan is looking to build upon. We've proposed basically a site plan that is a 6-acre parcel, and we've organized it into 3 development blocks. Block 1 at the northwest, Block 2 at the northeast, and Block 3 at the south. We've divided the blocks with the new public street that's been introduced through the middle of the site, connecting Borough Drive to Brian Harrison Way. And that new street will provide new street trees, wider sidewalks, and a new connection to Albert Campbell Square. Borough Drive, in its final design, will be a very wide boulevard featuring new sidewalks, a bike lane, a double row of trees. And we've also introduced a new north-south condo road between blocks 1 and 2, which will provide a new alignment for the city sewer, as well as more permeability through the site for both traffic and pedestrians. The park has been proposed at the south. It's a 0.53 acre park. And it's currently the location of the woodlot. So we thought that it's the most ideal location to place the park to preserve that natural feature. And it allows that to effectively connect to what could be an impressive ring road or ring park leading to the Hand of God Park. What we're proposing for Tower A is a 50-story podium, 50-story point block with a 6-story podium with some above grade parking and some retail and residential units at grade. Tower B is also a 50-story point block on a 6-story podium with residential and retail at grade, and that you can see that 6-story wraps along onto Street A. Tower C, D, and E are connected by a bridge, which allows shared amenities and creates a street wall along Street A, which is also 6 stories. There's an entrance into what's a drop-off court, which provides access to all three lobbies. And the placement of the towers effectively are staggered. So A and B are staggered diagonally. And then what we've done is allowed for C, D, and E to also have a triangular configuration so that there's no overlapping views. And we have building D effectively acting as the terminus for that grand vista to the south. The rooftops are going to have a combination of outdoor amenity spaces, which are associated with the indoor amenity spaces, and towers have appropriate setbacks and mitigation to allow the outdoor amenity to serve their intended uses. Next slide, please. For the ground floor, please. What you can see here, and the legend should help you identify all the uses. We've in yellow are the residential lobbies, which you can see are addressing the corners of Street A or Triton, and also the drop-off. In orange are the grade-related units, which are around the perimeter of the site and also visually shield all of the service-related areas. And on the blue, what we've done along Triton to respond to the POPs that's happening on the north is to allow for some retail space along Triton Street to activate those uses to the north. What we have effectively done is allowed for, you can see in gray, bike parking all throughout the ground floor for very easy access for anybody using secondary means of transportation. Next slide. Here you can start to see there is a component of above grade parking, but what we've tried to do is flank that around the perimeter for the majority of those faces with activated uses, which you can see in orange. The gray is some of the above grade parking component. In pink, that's the indoor amenity space. So we're oversupplying the indoor amenity space, and we're slightly lower on the outdoor to allow for a 4 square meter ratio between indoor and outdoor. Next slide, please. And you can see that this continues until we get into the tower plates. Next slide, which are 750 square meters in size. And again, you can see the great separation between those towers with as much as 50 meters between some of them. Next slide. In context, you can see our aerial, which shows how our Street A plugs into the existing context, and the 6-story podium relates back to that built form. And you can see a gentle scaling down of the form as it relates back south towards the park. On the right, you can see the ghosted context that is emerging. Next slide. Here's a view looking south along Street A, which has a pedestrian scale podium with that accented bridge, basically creating an entry, our signature building in the rear, and then 2 flanking buildings that are effectively twins of each other, with the 26-story being the lowest to try to minimize any impacts on shadowing on the square. Next slide, please. The northern 2 towers also have a very strong vertical expression, which expresses itself into the roof lines. And what we're trying to do is create, 5 unique buildings in a sense, but also maintain a lot of the similar kind of design language so that all of the blocks work together quite nicely, but there's still a lot of variety within both the built form expression of the towers and the podium. And you can start to see how activated the ground floor is with some of the retail. Next slide. This is a shot within the courtyard, which basically shows how open this is going to be. So the intent is really to allow people to move from the north, even that north-south street or Street A, through this, and then that can effectively connect back into the park at the south. There's a set of stairs that lead you down there, and we have activated street frontage. Next slide. And as we walk through, that leads to this area, which are the grade-related units, where there's a slight grade difference for privacy, but you can see the manicured yards, all the canopies, individual entrances. The idea is really to activate the park with eyes on the street surveillance, and you can see the lobby on the left-hand side also being double-sided, allowing for that visibility onto the park. Next slide. And this is, as we continue along Borough, this is going to be a great street with bike lanes, double row of trees. And what we've tried to do is effectively, have a 6-story base with a variety of materials set back to the tower. And then the next slide, you'll see, we'll just kind of walk you down the street. This leads to effectively the entrance in and a very open space to allow permeability through the site, and also framing that entrance as we eventually move towards the east. Next slide. And this is another view of really the transformation of the street and the connection through the site, and even the condo road that we're doing to the north, we want to really make feel like a public street as well. And that wraps up our presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to both of you for the presentation. We're going to move on now to questions of clarification from panel members. It can be directed to the city team, and it can also be directed towards the proponent team. So I see we'll start with Heather, and if you can raise your virtual hands as you're starting to do, that'll allow me to keep track of everything. So we'll start with Heather, then Jim Goff, and then Dima. Over to you, Heather.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much for the presentation. Maybe a quick question to the city first. The alternative plan that you proposed and presented, does that alleviate the shadow impact at all on Albert Campbell Square? And if so, by how much?
It does. So the biggest impact of shadow are the southern towers, specifically 518. So it alleviates the shadow impact by about an hour. There would still be shadow impact at 618 and by the northern towers, but it does improve shadow between 418 and 618. So about an hour and a half.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then to the presenting team, I'm just wondering, we've been asked as a panel about the SRT commemoration and the site heritage. I'm just wondering, specifically related to the Bell Building. I'm just wondering if I appreciated the explanation about the evaluation criteria, but wondering if there are any other thoughts with respect to commemorating or memorializing any of these site pieces.
We've only recently received comments from staff with regards to this request. So we are still studying that and have to have discussions with staff in terms of the intent. But we think we can incorporate that into the pop space or the park, for example, and what form and content that it takes. We'll still need to discuss that with staff.
Okay, great. Thank you. And one last question. The rooftop amenity locations for the development, I'm just curious if you could give us a few points about the rationale. I think on the north properties, the amenity is sort of facing outward, and in the south properties, it's a bit more inward facing. I'm just wondering what your thought process was there.
Sure. I don't know, maybe if you want to share this presentation again, David. So a lot of the indoor amenity spaces are in relationship to the blocks. We felt that, especially with Block B, there was an appropriateness to address Triton and Street A with built form in the form of a mid-rise. And the logical place ended up becoming kind of the central portion. Usually we like to reserve the lower portions of the building for indoor amenity space. There may be some opportunities, upon kind of reflection and some comments from the city to potentially add onto the top of some of the roofs, or even add a little bit to the ground floor. But effectively, that's the reasoning for building B. Building E and D what we effectively have is that bridge which connects buildings E and C. So there's going to be an indoor amenity space that's going to be linked there. So it's very logical to create an outdoor amenity space that ties into that within the pocket you can see between C and D. And then we thought that actually it would be quite a nice feature to have some lower portion of the building on top of what would effectively be the townhouse forms to overlook the like what will be a park. Right now, we're only seeing the park at the lower portion of the building. It's unclear if the city later on will turn that parking lot into a larger park. I'm not sure if that's in their plan at all, but I would anticipate that that might be something that they may want to do. So we've allowed for some outdoor amenity space to overlook that way, and then the other one at the north was again trying to frame the condo road, allow for some flexibility in terms of framing it's basically tied to the placement of the tower.
Yeah.
We have a wing for the tower north and the wing for the tower east.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you both. We're going to move on to Jim Goff, then Dima, Jim Melvin, and then Joe. So back to you, Jim G.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Just a question for the proponent team, and I think you may have answered it. So the purpose of that second floor bridge, could you just explain that in a bit more detail?
So it has a couple of functions. One, we know building E is a little bit compressed in terms of a block. But what we really wanted to do, and we've done this successfully in other projects, like 939 Eglinton, Upper East, Sasha would know that one very well, where we've really tried to create a sense of entry into a place. So on top of like what we see is there's advantages of having three buildings being able to share one indoor amenity space in terms of not having duplication, in terms of allowing for more spaces to be used for alternates, like more spaces for children or other things. So instead of duplicating spaces, you consolidate, and that bridge serves a function of sharing that between those three phases to create a really great amenity package, but also a very nice entry feature into what's the drop-off court and pedestrian access to the park to the south.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. On to Dima.
Thank you for the presentation. I had a couple of questions. One, Heather, I think, asked it. So just to clarify again, and the question of commemoration has only come up late with the city. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's correct. We got comments in August, so we're still working through those.
Thank you. In terms of the buildings themselves, the height of the podiums were derived from what? What is determining like their height?
So there's a combination of relationships. I mean, in theory, Borough Drive is a much wider street, so you could potentially go higher on Borough. But what we have seen is effectively Street A is 20 meters. We've got a condo road that we're introducing between the two, and it just found that 6 seemed to be a kind of a nice medium between those, one extreme of Borough and Street A. Plus, there's each one of those podiums has grade related units, so there's at least 10 feet in front of each one of those for outdoor manicured yards. So effectively, the face to face between those buildings is somewhere in the range of 26 to 27 meters. So we felt that that was a kind of a nice scale in order to maintain that and be consistent with that throughout the entire development.
Thank you. I'm sorry, one last question. You mentioned a POP, and I don't know if I'm missing it on the plans. Could you point to which area you're referring to?
So there's the area on the current plan. There's the area between the two buildings, as well as along this edge condition. That could be we're looking at a POP situation or part of the park. And then staff have also mentioned in their design elements entertaining of pops at the north end. So if that's the direction that we eventually end up in, the commemoration could go into that pops as well.
Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Jim Melvin next. Jim, are you there? If you're talking, you're muted.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
I unmuted, then I muted. Thank you, Gord. A potential question for the staff. There's approximately 5,000 new people coming to this new development, and the proponent says that information states that there is 2 off-leash dog areas in the remnant woodlots. How much are those woodlots used, and what's their capacity for another, I'll say, 1,500 dogs from this development?
It's an excellent question. Unfortunately, I don't know what their capacity is. I would expect, just based on my observation, that they could not accommodate another potentially 1,500 dogs.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kelly, for that answer. So then I will ask the proponent. They've done a great job at providing interior amenity space, actually double their exterior amenity space. Where is their off-leash dog area located for their development? The proponent.
Right, do you want to tackle this one?
Sorry, where the current proposed amenity area is?
No, where's your current off-leash dog area for the new 1,500 dogs that are going to come to this development?
We haven't.
How are you handling dogs on your
we
site?
haven't actually designated that yet, Jim.
So that's something you still have to consider.
Yes.
Would that be in your new park area of 0.53 acres? So if that's the case, you've got 5,000 new people on 0.53 acres. You're down to maybe a half to a square meter of open space per new persons coming to the site. Now you're going to take more space away for their dogs. I think you have to reconsider the amount of open space that you need to provide. You're providing more public street than you are open space for the people who are moving here. That
Jim,
just doesn't make sense.
In the future, if you could ask that as a question of clarification, that would be good. And you can bring it up during comments.
Yeah. So Jim, I think there's certainly maybe some more work to do there. If this park was kind of looked at in complete isolation, maybe. But when you look at it in the larger context, in the planned context, I mean, it's incredible actually the amount of park that this is going to connect into. You can see a large park designated at the south that's already in place, which this is going to tie into. Hopefully, in the fullness of time, that other triangular piece may be, filling out that park. I think this plan that's set up by staff and I guess the applicant to the north is contemplating, quite a good investment. And we'll deal with obviously the dog relief areas and other things that can be dealt with somebody coming down from their building, and we will find spaces for them on site. But in terms of off leash, I think there's a lot of opportunities here that residents could make known to the city about potential uses for those areas. I've seen some amazing off dog leash areas in Manhattan or other places that actually can be pretty compact. So let us take that one back and see how that's maybe there's ways of incorporating it.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to Joe and then Ralph.
Two questions. The first is, I haven't heard the word affordable housing from anybody today yet. Can I please hear something from the proponent about how they're committed to affordable housing with the volume and density proposed? And second, I would appreciate a comment from the proponent about the difference between slide 31 in the city's presentation, which is the Scarborough Center study plan, which shows a clear kind of relationship between an east-west public street and a north-south pop street, I will call it, connecting green space to the north to a green space to the south. And I contrast that to the proponent's image on both their site plan, which effectively takes the area south of the east-west street and privatizes it as a kind of cul-de-sac for vehicles, not a pedestrian zone. And then slide 31, which really emphasizes this kind of narrow opening to a public space. And my question is about sort of the importance of porosity in developing a new public realm. So how does the proponent's plan adequately respond to the Scarborough Center plan as illustrated on slide 12 of the city's presentation? Thanks, Gord.
So let me respond on the point with regards to affordable housing. We have not entered those discussions with city staff yet, but there will be a significant community benefits charge associated with this development, which can be put towards affordable housing, similar to other development applications that have been recently approved in the city of Toronto. So there will be a component, I assume, and would suspect, of affordable housing that will be incorporated through that mechanism. Henry, do you want to speak to the connectivity component?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for your question, Joe. So we've received that, and obviously we've seen the city's alternate plan. It's fairly new for us, and as stated, we just got this in August, and we will be responding to that in kind of a more positive way to reinforce that. I think, there's always a challenge in these things of what's private, what's public. And I think there's, in no means are we trying to kind of create a gated community or anything. The idea always is to allow for people to come out at grade and share any of those uses, and not even if regardless of whether it's designated a POPs or not, the intention is to allow for it to feel like you're allowed to kind of move through the space. So there is, we're going to take that back and look at ways to, reinforce it from what we have now. So it's fairly new, but we know that there's some ways that we can improve it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Okay, on to Ralph and then Aladia.
I promise I'm going to ask questions.
And questions of clarification.
Clarification. Two. One is the park. Is it a fulsome park dedication? Is it exactly what is required? And two, can someone just explain how the grade change along Triton is handled? Because there's a significant grade change from the north side to the south side. And I just want to kind of figure out where that all happens specifically, of course, with the existing infrastructure that's there. But if somebody can kind of help us from the team to kind of describe that.
Sure. First off, our intention is to convey the full amount that's required for the park. So we're not asking for cash in lieu. That is the requirement. Yes.
And that's what. Okay, great, thanks.
That's the requirement. Maybe somebody could share the screen for the north, for the ground floor, then maybe we could address that question. Okay, so I think there's definitely some changes in grade here. This was one of the kind of advantages in a sense of allowing for retail to happen at the north, because it's something that can cascade or be somewhat flexible in terms of the floor level, particularly on the block that's towards the west. On the east, it's a little bit more challenging, and so the idea was to have a little bit of a raised area that was directly outside of the retail, and then there's steps down that get you to to the sidewalk along Triton. But so it does get a lot more steeper as you move towards the east, but along the other areas, some of it can be mitigated by changes in the level of the retail.
Sorry, just to clarify, Henry, where the blue retail is at the northeast corner of Block B, right? Block B?
Yes.
That would be kind of raised, I guess. It would be a change in grade between the sidewalk at the curb and that retail.
Yeah, I believe what we have is it does flatten out. There's a slight retaining wall condition there, and then there's some steps that come down. Greg, correct me if I'm misstating any of that.
Correct, Henry. And just to further, just in terms of accessibility at the northwest corner where you see it says main lobby, at that point is where the beginning of that divergence occurs, where the retail side has an upper level that begins to terrace away from the street level. But however, anyone can access the retail aspect from that northwest corner. It's all still going to be fairly flush there. And then you'll have basically a series of vanishing stairs that begin to appear as you go eastwards. Hopefully that's clear.
Yes.
Thank
yes. You. Okay. Last set of questions from Eladia.
Hi, everyone. I have two questions, and one is for the proponent. One is for both the city and the proponent. So first question is, what are your sustainability goals?
So at this point in time, we're meeting the TGS version 4 Tier 1. We haven't decided if we're going to expand upon that beyond into Tier 2 or 3.
Okay, it might be a good time, right, to think about that. Sorry, I'll say that in comments. And second question is for both the city and the proponent. Curious about the I guess the differences between the proponent's plan and the city's recommendations, and what are the what's the driving reasoning? So I am assuming that the city's proposed alternative plan is to reduce the overall height of all of the towers to reduce shadow impacts and still maintain a staggering spacing between the towers. And the proponent's plan of tower location is to maintain views and, I guess, efficiency of constructability for 4 towers only, instead of what the city is recommending as sort of like 6. So am I understanding those dynamics correctly? And do you have anything else to add, proponent and city, about the driving forces between the differences between the plans? Because I do notice the city and the proponent are 10 stories different in their recommendations for the heights, the maximum heights of the towers.
I can answer that, Eladia. So one of the big driving points is the public realm network. We're trying to create more open space at grade. Currently, there's a lot of building coverage for this site. So we're really trying to create more private open space at grade and connect the different public realm pieces. So the POPs would connect to the public street, which would connect directly to the public park. So it's a more porous public realm network. That's our main priority in terms of the 2D level. At the 3D level, we're really just trying to protect the public realm network, specifically Albert Campbell Square, in terms of shadow impact. So it's massaging the building heights to limit impact on an important square within Scarborough Centre.
And from our perspective, I think it's we applaud those objectives, and we've come forward with a plan that we thought met a number of those. Obviously, staff have come forward with some commentary in terms of the public realm some of those moves in terms of the POPs and the connectivity, which we're looking at. Relative to the building height, obviously, I don't need to reiterate the fact that we're short of housing throughout this country. And so every additional story that's lost means lost housing. Relative to shadow impacts, there is shadow impact from 418, starting at 418 to 618 in the shoulder seasons. However, that is the amount of sunlight or shadow impact is artificial. Staff have reduced it from 918 to the time frame 918 to 618 to 1118 to 618. So in our opinion, unlike the rest of the city, which treats the entire day for shadow impact, there is more than 7 hours of sunlight on the square as a result of this development. And that might be the emergency direction in the study, but it's simply a study at this point in time.
And I just want to add
And
to this point.
if you could, sorry, if I could just cut in for a second. I want to make sure if you could keep this conversation short so that we have sufficient time for the actual discussion by panel members. Go ahead.
There is currently shadow until 11:18 a.m. on Albert Campbell Square, so we're looking for a continuous sunlight hours starting at 11:18 to 6:18.
Okay.
The city's proposed
back to Eladia. Sorry to cut in. Is your question being answered? And do we need to take it
into a follow-up because I'm now confused. Is the overall volume of tower housing provided the same between the cities and the proponents? Because I see there's 6 towers, if I'm reading the plans correctly, in the cities proposed, and 4 in the proponents. So I'm assuming that we're rebalancing heights by adding additional clusters of heights.
The number of buildings is the same. The heights has been reduced. Again, this has to be further studied in terms of impact of shadow on Albert Campbell Square. So we're looking at a reduction in height to both deal with the emerging secondary plan on terms of building heights and height strategy, but also to try to limit impact on the square. So that there is a reduction in the city's plan. How much, that is to be studied through the shadow studies.
Okay, but I am reading the plan correctly. There's there's an extra tower in the city's alternative plan, is there not?
No, it's a mid-rise building.
Okay.
There's 5 towers in both schemes. There's an additional mid-rise.
I'm going to call time. I think some of these questions could be turned into comments during panel discussion. So if that's okay with the panel members, we'll move forward into that. So you still get a chance to provide the input. So we're going to move on to panel discussion, and keep in mind the comments that have come through from the staff when you give your answers or give your input. And I'm going to start with Heather, Ralph, and Eladia. Over to you.
Thank you.
Heather. Thank
you. Thanks for the comments. There are many panel members here today, so I'm going to try and keep my comments quite succinct and lean on the questions that the city has asked us. So with respect to the shadows on Albert Campbell Square, this is a complicated question, but I do believe that more study is required here. I think the heights of the towers, I don't have any issue with. The tower separations are great. I think you yourself mentioned that there's 50 meters. There's some generous separations, but I really think that those should not be prioritized over the shadow impact on Albert Campbell Square, which I understand is a very well used open space. So if you have extra room on the site, I wonder if some of those tower separations could go down to the 25 meters in favor of increasing the 7 hours straight of sunlight onto the square. So I think additional study there is warranted. With respect to so the second question was about tower heights and transition. I don't have any issues with the tower heights proposed. With respect to transition, I actually think in this case and looking at the kind of master plan studies and secondary plans, I don't really see a big reason for going from, low to high across the site in any direction. I think there have been, lots of discussion and argument about heights going up and down, an idea of a skyline instead of a kind of tent pole. So I'm not really worried about that. With respect to the heritage and commemorating the rapid transit, I do think there are some opportunities here. The precast U's and V's that support that defunct system, I think could be reused. The city mentioned an idea of of a high line. I'm not sure. And appreciating that this was an early comment for the team. So I think it is important to actually take a moment now and consider the reuse of maybe some of those elements or a new use. With respect to the existing building on the site, the Bell building, one of the most interesting aspects about that building, I think, is its roofscape. It's got incredible terraces. It probably was very cutting edge in its day. Looks like there was an idea about health and wellness with respect to the office building. So I'm wondering if this proposal could actually commemorate or take some cues from that aspect of that building and really start to carve up some of those rooftop amenities into more of roofscapes. I think that would really speak to the Scarborough City Hall building, because I mean this site is right close to that building, so I think it's very important to try and have a kind of dialogue like the Bell building had with the City Hall building. I think you'll probably hear more from Joe about this, but one of the issues I have with the site plan is that I appreciate some of the porosity moves that are being made here. I really think this development is a bit too inward looking, and it seems to be um, a bit too fixated on this kind of symmetrical road system, which I think was intended to celebrate a big park at the end of it. But right now it's kind of a dead end loop, and it's a small aperture to the park that's at an angle. So um, I really think that if the disposition of towers were to move, this road network need not be symmetrical, but I think it's very important that a kind of green space ends this as a kind of placemaking move and to maintain, the original heart and intent of the secondary plan. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Before we move on, I did forget to mention, if you can each panel member 3 minutes, self-manage your time, and we'll be able to get everybody in. We're going to
Just
move
before
on.
I speak, right?
Oh, I know. There's no connection. There's absolutely no connection whatsoever.
It's okay. I'll take my 3 minutes.
Okay.
So
On to
just to
Ralph.
kind of,
Thank you.
16 years ago, joining the panel, we started seeing the entertainment district get intensified. And as a group of panel members, we desperately asked the city to create more park and create more public amenity for this neighborhood. For whatever reason, that did not happen. And I say that we've created an entire neighborhood that isn't as livable as it should be. So when we come down to a conversation of there's a lot of park in this area, I think that I would say, and I've been saying this, reviewing the Scarborough Center how many times now, that there isn't enough. There's unbelievable amount of supply. It's almost like just unbelievable. And so the idea of one floor of density for me, when you look at the entire neighborhood, is truly insignificant. And so what is really important is that we make an amazing place to live. And I work for private developers. And so I am not going to say anything about height. I'm going to say, hey, the height's great. I would dispense it a little different. Actually, like peaks and valleys, and I would say maybe building D could be taller and then go back down and make a signature building that's south on the north side of a park. I do think, though, that if I don't care about height and get all your 1,500 dogs and all that, that you need to make something amazing. The ask is lots of density, great. But what I see here is the making's an amazing opportunity that these simple gestures can be amplified. And it is that intimate relationship at grade that I think you sincerely need to look at. Like when I hear that there's retail that's tucked behind the lobby on Triton that's not so great, that you're going to put some retail that you know is going to fail. So maybe that should be an amenity space, because that this level just is not going to work for it, and it's going to be unfortunate. And so make something great. I think that the park to park, this kind of dumbbell connection between the condo road, the kind of central drop off, and then the future park addition is the big move. And that should be the most amazing space. It should be a space for all your inhabitants as well as the neighborhood that surrounds it. There's a great opportunity. I think that, again, being sensitive, the southeast corner of Block B, at the turnaround adjacent to an existing kind of quasi-suburban condominium as a kind of flank of a parking lot, is not very sensitive. And I think it's winning all the little spaces. I've been saying, again, over the years at Scarborough, that you've got all the big moves, you need small spaces. There, the POPs allows for that kind of filigree of wonderful opportunity to make small spaces for the elderly, the young, and everybody in between. And what I just see here are just the big moves, and I think that this is easily handled. I would lose the drop off. I mean, I've been saying this. I just think the drop off is a lie. That space is not a space. That space is parking ramps, loading, drop off, Uber, and it's not a place of gathering. It's not a place of joy. It could be the most amazing public garden that allows people to go through it, connecting from the north park to the south park. So I'd say that I think your public realm has to be juiced up. You have to start with your public realm first. You've got your buildings, you've got your density. Now see, by trimming a little of fat here and there. One other thing I would say is I do believe that the Triton Road could actually take a pop space. I think you could just square off the block A at the north end and create a small space with retail that completely wraps it, that supports that space. And so it's the small scale wins with a very big vision about public realm. Right now, you've given me the minimum, and I'm going to say, if you want all that height, you want all that density, just go for it and make the most amazing public realm. Yeah, I'm positive that your client and the people that they're selling or renting to are going to need it, and they're going to want it, and they'll be really proud of it. And I think everybody wants to be proud of what they build. So that's my commentary.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. I'm going to move on to Aladia, and then Jim Goff and Jim Melvin. Aladia.
I definitely echo, I think, some of the comments from Heather, especially, and Ralph as well. Would be great to have a clear view down the condo road and a less pinched gateway to the proposed park. Right now, the interior area is purely vehicular. Like there is some setback, but it definitely will feel that is for vehicles. And so being able to have a pleasant route down through the new development into that park and creating a sense of connection. So connecting green spaces so that the life of the remaining woodlot can be part of the perceptual reality and introduction to this new, your entryway into this new facility. It'll help bring together the natural amenity that continues to exist on the site into the experience of the residents. Right now, it's so closed off, this tiny little access point that it doesn't really play a role at all in the perceptual reality of the tenants. So I do support perhaps finding another green anchor point at grade that is open space, whether it is off of Triton there or in another location, so that perceptual reality of the space is one of we are living in a green space, and I'm coming to my suite through a green space. That will really help, because right now all of the interior streets, the loop, will feel very vehicular, and plus there's even that built bridge over top, which increases the perception that this is a built zone, not a green zone. So I think maybe think about that. One of the principles of really good habitat design, it works for humans as well, but it works great for organisms, is the more you can interconnect green spaces and habitat zones, the more organisms you can support. It's actually really quite profound, the impact you can have by creating interconnections between even the smallest little habitat zones. And you'll find that the organisms that are supported are greatly enhanced. And in turn, we as humans have a much healthier experience moving through spaces that are cognizant of that. There needs to be some sort of acknowledgement from this development of Triton Road, the SRT. What that is, I don't know, but I think there has to be some sort of gesture, because right now I think the site just ends. So there's sort of no gesture towards that. And then in terms of the architectural expression, I don't have a whole lot to say. I think the design is showing parallels but differences between all of the towers. So I think your intentions as stated are being realized. For me, I think what maybe is missing is that openness, the feeling of openness and views at grade is what's missing, because I think you've really considered openness and views in the air. So just apply those same principles at grade and you're off to the races.
Great. Thank you, Eladia. Moving on to Jim Goff.
Thank you for the presentation. In short, I agree with Ralph. Right now, this is functional, and that's not a bad thing. But with the incredible amount of density proposed, I think amenity really is the key issue, as a number of others have mentioned. This has to be made a livable community. Otherwise, it's just going to be a vertical suburb. There's a great deal of paved area in the middle of the south block, and I think the proponents should try to find ways to minimize that to, as Ralph said, make this a great space leading to the park. So that, as he said, should be the real big gesture to making this a great place and a livable community. So I would also agree that the drop-off should be located underground to try to minimize the amount of space allocated to cars at the surface here, because it's precious. You know, you're putting building on virtually all of the site, so people need space as well. So further to that, I think a more direct link to the park, creating that visibility to it, would be much better in terms of the connection for pedestrians. It's not really adequate porosity right now. So I think you can do something amazing here, and I would really encourage you to do that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Jim Melvin.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I agree with all of the comments from my fellow members, especially I think Heather hit it right on that the central spine has to end in that green space with a termination of that's much bigger than 5 trees than what you're showing now. In Scarborough, and especially Scarborough Town Square, the ice rink and the area that's in Albert Campbell Square, sunlight is sacred. even if it is only a couple of hours of difference, it's worth it. The area is plagued with its own shadow on the ice rink, and it's also a very windy. There's nothing protecting the area from wind, so anything that can make that a little more inhabitable, or habitable, I should say, is welcome. So I believe the 7 hours is sacred and has to be met. I totally agree with the design intent of the city's alternative, with a little more friendly, lower scaled development towards the park face and along the park boundaries. And finally, I think you have to consider the dogs and what you're going to do with it. We always talk about cars. We don't seem to talk about the spaces for people enough. And then they always bring their dogs, and that puts more pressure on the sustainability of the open spaces that we have now. So there has to be a little more work on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. On now to Dima, Olivia, Anna, and then Joe. Back to you, Dima.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think a lot of people have said things I very much agree with. I'm just going to start with this idea of the commemoration. It's important, if we're trying to commemorate something, to understand why we're commemorating it, and for it not to become, which unfortunately is happening more and more, kind of a knee-jerk reaction to accept demolition. So if we're looking at the Bell Building and this SRT and understanding what we have to first understand what's important about them, and then to understand what to commemorate them. And beyond their like formal expression, certainly for the SRT, it speaks to like an old transit and interconnectivity. And if we're looking to commemorate it, if that's a serious intent from the city, I would look at how it can be not viewed isolated on the site, but how maybe it becomes a way to connect through art or through other open spaces where it used to run, and connects multiple sites and can end up being like a line throughout this whole development project, rather than have it isolated on the site. For this site in particular, I think Ralph's idea of just pushing it back and creating a pop in the north would certainly alleviate what is now sort of on the ground plane. It's like the domain of the car. There really isn't any space for people on the ground plane. And that little discussion of having the pop on the condo road, I don't think is being realized at all. So that's an important consideration. For the Bell Building, there is its formal architecture, but one of the things that struck me most about the building is its actual relationship to the Civic Center, and particularly at the corner of Brian Harrison Way at the roundabout. And it had a conversation it was doing with the Civic Center, which currently at that corner of that site, it's a very that's maybe where that commemoration can occur, of having an architecture that is more welcoming, more open, that geometrically or can express some kind of conversation. Because at the moment, if we're talking about making this open and more friendly to people, every bit of that plane and that itself is an important gateway onto the site. And understanding how one can carve out space there. There's kind of a carving out of the Bell Building to sort of echo the curves of the Civic Center. So maybe there's an opportunity there to create an open space at grade where there's a conversation that's going to occur between the architecture of the new buildings being proposed and the architecture of the Bell Building. And that, in a way of like retaining that like old context, is a way of commemorating and expressing the building. So I think going back to the why, like what is important about the Bell Building that could be commemorated, and putting that onto the site. I think I would agree with the other comments that the roundabout it's basically creating like a turn for cars with no place for people, and that should be reconsidered. completely in terms of its expression. And my last comment is just maybe about Borough Drive. At the moment, Borough Drive, if you're talking about density and having more housing on the site while reducing building heights, I think the height of the podiums around Borough Drive could be increased substantially without really impacting the quality of the street networks or impacting the shadows on the parks to the south. And having, instead of having uniformity in the podiums on the streets, having some variation could actually provide more housing while alleviating the tower heights. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dima. Moving on to Olivia, then Anna and Joe. Olivia.
Thank you very much for your presentation. This is a really important site. It's a really challenging site, and I think that's why we all have so many comments about it. You're right at the heart of Scarborough and right across from the Civic Center. You're at a really transit-rich site. There's so many opportunities here. I would just say that I really support all of the city's concerns about shadowing, about providing more open space. And I think I'm really encouraged by the proponents' comments that you are open to addressing them. And I would really encourage this continuing dialogue. I'm going to build on some of Dima's comments about the existing building, because I think we didn't really talk a lot about sustainability, but demolition of a 6-story office building that has carbon embodied in it is absolutely about sustainability. And I just did a quick napkin sketch. There's about 20,000 tons of carbon embodied in this building. So I'm not arguing for retention of the building, but I think you have not done enough work to demonstrate that some of it could not be retained, or that you could, if that's not possible, then I think you need to start from this point of acknowledgement and give back through either enhanced sustainability targets or enhanced pedestrian realm. Leave it up to you, but I think you need to take this as your starting point. In terms of commemoration, I agree with many of Dima's comments. I think don't just look at the aesthetics of the building. I think the way that it impacts movement around the site and the sort of dialogue that it creates with the Civic Center is really something that this building is successful at, and that you can really build on. In terms of the pedestrian experience, I agree with many of the comments already made. I think you talked about the walkways being sort of wide and tree-lined. When I look at your site plan, to me, it looks like the site is just overtaken by vehicles. And I think perhaps some closer sectional studies of smaller scale and finer grain might be helpful, either for you to illustrate that you have made this a great public realm, or for you to develop that idea further. I think your work to make this a better pedestrian realm will really allow you to get a lot more aggressive on your parking counts. I think given the amount of transit in this neighborhood, one sustainability strategy is to get a lot more aggressive on the amount of parking that you're providing. I don't think it's necessary in this neighborhood. And then finally, I think the streets require more activation. I don't think that a residential program provides the kind of activation that you're looking for, perhaps at certain times of day. But certainly, if I look at, if I consider walking down the streets that you've designed as a woman alone at night, I don't feel safe walking down these streets. I think that more effort needs to be made to activate them and to define what the heart of the development is and how people will be moving through it, through the activation. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Anna, and then Joe.
Thanks, Gordon. Thank you for your presentation. This is a very important project. I mean, it's a really a grand scale for a development. When you think about the number of people who are going to live here, I think the the number that was mentioned was 5,000 homes, and how what this place is going to be to those 5,000 families in the future, I think is a really important question. And I think you've gotten lots of advice about that. And I think there was just a few points that I wanted to emphasize in there, because I think where things really need to be picked up on is the storyline and the sense of place of this development. It feels very much like an exercise of finding space for 5,000 units rather than creating a community of 5,000 units. So I think there was a lot of threads that were kind of pulled out today to think about what can build upon the character of this place. You know, all your drawings really show a site plan floating on a white page. You know, so what is there around that? What are those streets and those public spaces going to feel like as they connect into your blocks? There was an image of Street A, which is something that you're creating. I think internally in the site. However, you know, you're going to have to contend with Triton and Borough Drive and, you know, the other side of the site, all of which have very different characters. And there is a history to this sense of place, that there's a history to this place, albeit, you know, it's fairly recent history. However, you know, the word geometric landscape was used several times in terms of what has been used as design devices in the area. And I think there's ways to kind of tag into that to give the edges of the site more character. And I know Joe is up next, but again, just on the porosity of the ground floor plane, and I think Ralph said it very well as well, you know, start from the ground up and think about what the ground plane is going to be like and how it's not going to be as overwhelming as it can be if you have these super blocks, which are impossible to pass through. You know, if I live at one of those tiny little 2-story units on one side of the site on Borough Drive, and I'm coming in from the transit on the other side, how do I get into my unit? Are there 3 ways for me to get into my unit? Or do I have to go into the big grand lobby and then go through a snake way of all of several corridors to get to my unit? Or can I walk in around the building through smaller passageways into a secondary entrance, and I have various opportunities to experience kind of the entry to the building, because I think you focused a lot of effort on big grand lobbies, of which there are only a few, where there are many different typologies that you have used in your buildings, and there could be different ways for residents to experience the entry into the building, as well as people walking by on the street, and that in itself creates a different level of interest along the streetscape as well as what Julie mentioned about a variety of uses around the base of the building. I think I'll end my comments there, and I will agree that that one last thing I will agree with is that the turning circle is a missed opportunity in terms of thinking of a grand cohesive space in the middle of the development that is for the residents and is a usable area rather than a place where people pass through and use for secondary loading and so on the site. But thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Last but not least, Joe.
Thanks, Gord. I wonder if Leanne or somebody on the staff could possibly put up slide 17 of the staff presentation. I really appreciated everyone's presentations today, both the staff team and the consulting team. Clearly, everyone's put a lot of thought and work into it all. And listening to everybody's commentary, what I'm seeing on the screen, by the way, is this page isn't working right now. I was hoping we might get to slide 17. I'm going to make a specific suggestion. Thank you. There we go. Yeah. I think this slide is hugely significant in terms of the evolution of work that all of you have put into. By this, I mean the consulting team, the development proponent, the staff team. I really appreciated this kind of imagery. So here are my observations and suggestions. I think to the proponent team, what you're hearing about is how important the public space is at grade, far more important than interior amenity space. Having more interior amenity space does not compensate for sufficient outdoor amenity space and POPs and parks. That there's a sense of privatization, appreciating not intended, but just respectfully to the proponent team, it comes across that way, especially south of Street A. The specific suggestions I would make on the diagram on the right, which I would strongly recommend become a potential way forward. I strongly support the kind of staff idea, which I suspect will not modify the density proposed much, but significantly increase what we've been hearing about is a potentially great development with a great sense of space. So here are some specific thoughts about that. On the POPs along Triton Road, you have these kind of wishbone concrete structures that support the overhead thing. The overhead thing goes, the width of those wishbones is a certain dimension. It's not a giant street dimension. It just supported a two-way transit thing. So maybe that width defines the width of that POP. And to Jim's point, that becomes one of those places where people can just take their dog for a walk and candidly just also provide a kind of green frontage at the top. A second observation would be this. On the northeast block, you are showing parking and loading accessed off Street A. However, in the balance, you're showing all the parking and loading accessed on the north-south so-called condo road. Might you reconsider putting all of that, if possible, on Street A and turning the north-south condo road into a green space, a place that vehicles are welcome to come, but it doesn't feel like a vehicle realm. And instead, it feels like a green realm that pedestrians are very welcome in, and that connects parks to the north to parks to the south in a very strong way. I think it's inevitable that the Board of Education property to the south, the triangle that off the right side of the right diagram, that'll become a major park. And so the at-grade amenity that the city is proposing at the south end is absolutely critical. It's not this kind of narrow, hole in the wall of a townhouse row. It's a kind of gesture towards this development contributing to a community-wide public realm. And Street A doesn't cut it. Street A is fine, but it's that north-south POP, or whatever one calls it, that is really going to be the link that makes this a pedestrian-friendly community over time. I would absolutely get rid of that bridge. The bridge is counterproductive. It actually works against the north-south connectivity for pedestrians, and the north-south connectivity, candidly, for nature and habitat to exist. The other specific suggestion I would make is as others have said, a reconsideration of retail. And just to modestly correct Anna, I think it's just over 2,000 units and potentially a population of 5,000, but still a lot of people. And I wonder at that intersection between a north-south greenway and Street A that, there's a coffee shop, there's a place maybe there's a bakery, there's, that the heart of this place is actually a place where you can go down from your unit, as Jim says, walk your dog, and maybe you're getting a coffee, you're picking up a loaf of bread. There's just a little more amenity along that, intersecting public kind of realm. I think it's relatively simple. And I really appreciate the effort and thoughtfulness of everyone concerned. And hoping for something wonderful to emerge here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you to all the panel members for the comments. I was wondering if we could put up page 3 of the proponent team's presentation, and it's called Site Context. Just hold for a second while that's put up. Getting close. Yes, that'll do. And if you could make it a little bit bigger, if possible, that's great. Yes, that's great. Okay. I know I'm supposed to identify the 5 key issues that panel members have identified, but I think that they've come through very clearly. And I think the comments about acknowledging the amount of work that's been done by both the proponent team and the city staff team is very important, because it's clear that there's been a lot of thought put into it. And I sense a desire to reach a solution that actually is not only good for the site, but also good for the neighborhood. And that's why this site context drawing is up on the screen. We, as a panel, have had a long relationship with Scarborough Town Centre. We've seen many projects that have occurred there. We've watched and participated in the setting of the dream of how this area can transition and be reborn as a truly urbane and urban environment. And along the way, we've seen some sites which have absolutely nothing around them that exists that could be said to be something that is highly attractive and would spark a creative solution. But the site that you have is not any site. It's truly remarkable. On the overall Scarborough Town Centre site, there are many parts of it that do not have the cultural context that it's immediately adjacent, indoor and outdoor. Fairly heavily forested space to the south of your site. And these are things that really need to be taken full advantage of. And the reason why I'm saying that is I remember you talked about the number of units. I know you talked about the need for people to have a place to live, but it also has to be livable. And you're in a competitive market. You need to have something that people will pay attention to, and it won't be like any other site in the Scarborough Centre. And I think the comments that panel members have made are leading you in that direction. And the reason why I asked for this image to come up, you can see the green, you can see the outdoor space immediately to the east, a major gathering space and a major green space in the entire Scarborough Town Centre area. And this gives you your opportunity, because right now, I think what you've done is that the development is stuck between suburban and urban. It checks all the boxes. You've got your unit count, you've got your number of floors and everything else, but is it a livable place? And I think the comments that have come through is not yet. And if you do the things that panel members have mentioned, if you look beyond the boundary, as one of the members had said, and take in the context that's around, especially the rich context that you can use to advantage, true advantage to market, and make each and every one of those units that you're going to invest in to build places that people want to live above all else in this area. And it's not there yet. The design is not there yet. And that's why looking outside the boundary, look at the ground, look what's there now, take advantage of it, connect with it, let that green space actually make its way up in through the major north-south that you've identified and turn it into, as people have said, pedestrian. Vehicular, put it in places where it will do no damage. And right now it does damage. So I thank you for pulling up this image. I think that the answers lie in the comments, but the answers lie in the DNA in the site that's around you and the existing things that you've truly, from a pure marketing and financial point of view, want to take advantage of. Thank you very much for your presentations. Thank you very much for all the comments. We've gone a little bit over. We're going to take a break now. But first of all, we have to vote. So I will call panel member's name, and you can tell me whether you're voting in support or non-support. And before I do that, in support, we have the possibility that key conditions can be added to the vote of support. So it's sort of like a conditional one. Typically, if there are just a few things that need to be done, if it becomes a long list, then it becomes the minutes. So I'm going to ask panel members, is there anybody who wants to put forward key conditions to the vote of support? Okay, I'm not seeing anybody. So what I'm going to say, I'm going to go through person by person. You tell me whether you vote for support or non-support, starting with Dima.
Non-support.
Non-support. And Juhi is not here. Heather.
Non-support.
Thank you. Jim Melvin.
Non-support.
Jim Goff.
Non-support.
Thank you. Joe.
Non-support.
Ralph. Ralph, are you there?
I'm here. Sorry. Non-support.
Non-support. Olivia.
Non-support.
Thank you. Anna.
Non-support.
Aladia.
Non-support.
Thanks, Aladia. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Have I missed any panel member? No. So voted. Again, thank you very much. We look forward to this coming back again. There is huge potential in this project. It's just not all fully unleashed yet. Thank you. So let's take a quick break. It is 2:46. We're supposed to start at 3. We'll take about, well, you've got the time between now and 3 o'clock and we'll start again. Okay. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you at 3.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the comments.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for the constructive comments.
Great. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you to the panel.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the second session this afternoon. And this session is related to the Consolidated Mid-Rise Building Design Guidelines. It's the first time that we've had this come before us. And I just wanted to welcome the city team and then also the panel members who are here this afternoon. This is an hour and 45-minute session, so we're giving a little bit more time. There's no vote at the end, but certainly time for providing comments. And staff, I understand, need a little bit more time. So we're going to, instead of 30 minutes, we'll have 35 minutes for city staff presentation. Leanne, is that going to be sufficient?
Well, I think so, yes.
Yes, okay, and we'll check it as it goes. And then what's going to happen, panel members, when we get to the time for comments, we'll have a little bit less time, and I'll give you a sense as to how many minutes in terms of self-managing your time when we get to the comment point. The session, just to remind everybody, the session is being live streamed on YouTube, and it's also being recorded. The recording will also be available on the City Planning YouTube channel following the meeting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with roll call, and I'll call your name. You can let me know if you're here and if you have any conflict of interest, and we'll start with Meg.
Present, no conflict.
Thank you, Meg. Dima.
Here, no conflict.
Thanks, Dima. Heather.
Here and no conflict.
Thanks, Heather. Jim Melvin. Hello, Jim. You might be on mute. You're still on mute, I think. Just raise your thumbs up. I can see you.
I'm present, unmuted, and here.
Okay, you're not virtual. Okay. All right. Thank you. Jim Goff.
Present and no conflict.
Thank you, Jim. Joe.
Present, no conflict.
Okay. See you're there. Ralph.
I mean, I guess I'm not conflicted, but I've got a lot of these mid-rise projects. So no conflict, I guess.
How
no
do I
conflict.
take that?
I don't know how present I am, but I definitely have no conflict.
Yeah, you look like somebody who's very conflicted, Ralph.
Okay, I'll put a question mark. Olivia.
Here, no conflict.
Thanks, Olivia. And Aladia.
Here, no conflict.
Thanks, Aladia. Have I missed any panel members? No? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the city staff introduction presentation. I'll give you a moment to pull it up on the screen. And we'll aim for 35 minutes. At the 34-minute mark, I'll let you know that you have a minute left, and you can tell me whether you're on target, okay? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, DRP members. My name is Rong Yu. I'm the project manager in urban design. I'm joined by my urban design colleague, Alexis Ovendijk, to present to you the Consolidated Mid-Rise Building Design Guidelines. So over the last 9 months, Alexis and I have primarily collaborated with all district urban designers, heritage planners, and the graphic visualization staff to analyze and update this consolidated mid-rise guidelines. So at today's DRP session, we will provide a summary of the key updates to the consolidated mid-rise guidelines. Before we started with the key updates, I would like to provide some background on the evolution of mid-rise performance standards and the objectives of this update. So the mid-rise performance standards, which was done by Brooke McRoy Consultant and the Pace Architects, was adopted by the City Council in 2010. Since then, hundreds of mid-rise buildings have been proposed and developed along avenues and in the mixed-use areas. So in 2016, the city's Planning and Growth Management Committee adopted a mid-rise monitoring report. It is called a Mid-rise Performance Standards Addendum. It addresses mid-rise development issues raised at the committee and the council, and also allows the mid-rise performance standards to be applied to citywide for various land uses. Next slides. So the image shown here are some mid-rise buildings constructed over the past decades. Next slides. Many attributes developed through the current mid-rise performance standards are making the mid-rise development successful, such as the overall scale of the mid-rise buildings, the street wall height, the articulation of the facade, the sunlight on the public streets, and the quality of the streetscape. All these attributes helps for mid-rise development on the avenues, also in the neighborhoods. In the apartment neighborhoods. Next slides. Through the practice, concerns about the 45-degree angular plan for the rear transition were raised from both the energy and the construction efficiency perspectives. So this 45-degree angular plan, which was originally intended as a zoning envelope rather than a building shape, results in a wedding cake shaped design at the back of the building for maximizing the GFA. Next slide. So in the 2022 to 2026 Housing Action Plan, updating rear transition in the mid-rise performance standards was identified as a part of the avenue and the mixed-use area work program. Next slide. So the avenues and the mixed-use area work program includes avenue policy review, expanding mixed-use areas, urban design rear transition update, and also updating as-of-right zoning for avenues to enable mid-rise development. Next slide. So based on this work program, urban design reviewed and consulted with industry expert on the rear transition performance standards in 2023. A proposal report on the draft mid-rise rear transition standards was presented at the Planning Housing Committee in June 2023. Next. So most of you probably already very familiar with this update. It basically removed the 45-degree angular plan and used the step back and the step back for the rear transition. So this update has been able to maintain the transition and also provide more flexibility with the design solutions. Next. Following the draft proposal, urban design, together with the zoning team, held several public and stakeholder consultations in the summer 2023. The consultation received the feedback on rear transition update, as well as the feedback on other performance standards in the current mid-rise guidelines. Next. So staff reported on the consultation feedback at the November Planning Housing Committee. There were two requests from Planning Housing Committee for mid-rise guidelines. So one was to finalize the rear transition performance standards in the middle of 2024. Another request was to send the draft consolidated mid-rise guidelines by the end of 2024. Next. So the zoning team and the urban design team conducted more consultations on the rear transition in the spring this year. We sent the June 2024 report to the Planning Housing Committee to provide a further update on the rear transition. Zoning team will send the final report to the Planning Housing Committee and the Council in October this year, which will include final updates to the rear transition in the bylaw. Next slide. So this rear transition final updates eliminates the upper 2.5 meter step back at the 10th floor to further simplify the mid-rise massing. Alexis will present more details on this final update later. Next. So parallel to the real transition update process, we have been working on the consolidated mid-rise building design guidelines. We plan to send the guidelines to Planning Housing Committee on December 5th, 2024. Next. So the consolidated mid-rise guidelines aim to encourage mid-rise development that are more economic to build and more environmentally sustainable. The updated guidelines will be consistent with the city's tall building and the low-rise guidelines to form part of the city's 3 building scales identified in the official plan build form policies. Next. So now we're going to move on to the guidelines key update and begin with the table of contents. So table of contents is a line with the tall building and the low-rise guidelines. Most current performance standards will be found in the section 2.0 site organization section, 3.0 mid-rise building design, next slides, and the 4.0 public realm sections. Next. So one thing to mention here is the current performance 19 represents a change in the table of contents. So we worked with the heritage planners to locate the performance 19 A, B, C in the site context section, which is related with the developments of the heritage properties and in the heritage conservation district context. And the next slides. So the performance standard 19D to 19G talks about the design of the building facade and the materials. These guidelines will be revised, improved, and incorporated into the building design section 3.0. Next. So move on, same as the tall building and the low-rise guidelines, the site context is the first section of the guidelines. Next. The design of the building begins with evaluating the site context. So there are existing context. The typical mid-rise building in Toronto are located in the main street context. They have retails on the ground floor. The building is close to the front and all side property lines. Residential floors above typical step back from the base building. And the mid-rise building also being developed in the residential neighborhood context. These buildings have active residential use, such as townhouse or garden units with individual entrance on the ground floor facing the streets. It also has a generous landscape setback in the front yard with opportunity to plant a second row of trees and the windows on all elevations to maximize residential units' comfort while avoid blank facades. So there are many other physical contexts to consider as well, including existing lot pattern, pedestrian cycling connection, the parks and open space, and mature trees in the area. Next. And we also needed to analyze the planned context based on city's official plan, urban structure, and the land use policies. These policies in the OP provides the vision for the area. The design of the mid-rise building needs to consider those emerging contexts. Next. So among the physical contexts, site typology or lot patterns have major influence on the mid-rise development. There are various lot patterns like deep or shallow lots, regular or irregular lots. So the chart here identifies the ideal lot depths based on the new mid-rise building envelope. So for example, if the building is on a 20-meter right-of-way, the ideal lot depth is 30 meters for a 6-story building. Next, the site typology analysis focuses on 2 typologies. One is the deep and the large sites. So the guideline will provide some demonstration plan and the guidance on designing the deep and the large sites. And you can see there's a various L-shape, T-shape, or U-shape arrangement on site, and address the deep corner sites, the deep mid-block sites, or deep courtyard sites, I'm not going through the detail of those design, but one thing to mention here is for the deep courtyard sites, we ask to provide approximately 1-to-1 courtyard width to building height ratio for this designing of the courtyard to allow for the access to the sunlight and the proper scale for the design of the courtyard and the amenity space. Next. So another site typology in this section is for through lot sites. Through the Yihang major streets work, many through lots. As you know, it's the backside facing the major streets and the front facing the local neighborhood streets gets be rezoned, and so they have opportunity to build 6-story buildings through Yihang major streets update. And with the city's avenue policy review work, some of these through lots will become the mid-rise development site. So the guideline will provide some guidance on these through lots. I apologize for the graphic. We haven't been able to update the graphic, so we use the Yihang's 3D model to demonstrate as a placeholder. And the update guideline will provide some site planning guidance for through lot sites, like in the residential context, to maintain the landscape, generous landscape, to allow for tree planting, encourage retail opportunities, and also provide the mid-block connection for the pedestrian and the cycling to connect between the major streets and the inner parts of the neighborhood. So there are some guidelines for these through sites. Now I'm going to pass on to Alexis to talk about the update for the rest of the sections.
Thanks, Roan. I'm just going to provide a high-level overview of the key updates to the guidelines related to building design first, and then move on to public realm. And we're just focusing on kind of highlighting the key updates resulting from our review at this point in time, just for the sake of time for this presentation. So starting firstly with mid-rise building height, the updated guidelines will define the height of mid-rise buildings in Toronto, and this definition will continue to be tied directly to the proportion between building height and the adjacent right-of-way onto which the building fronts, so maintaining that one-to-one relationship. The update will also include 45-meter rights-of-way and introduce 45 meters or 14 stories as the maximum height of a mid-rise building. While reiterating that buildings of this height should be on 45-meter rights-of-way. And then lastly, we'll also recognize circumstances where additional heights above the 1-to-1 ratio may be considered, specifically on deep and/or large sites. And this would be if other policies and guidelines can be met, and if the site is in close proximity to a transit station. So generally, mid-rise building heights should be no taller than the width of the adjacent right-of-way, with building heights at a 1-to-1 ratio, with the right-of-way width ranging from 5 stories, approximately 16.5 meters, and 14 stories, approximately 45 meters. As it relates to front facade design, the update will introduce a new suite of guidelines that kind of more comprehensively consider the massing, scale, and articulation of the front facade and the street wall. So in doing this, the updated guidelines will replace the front facade angular plane requirements in the existing performance standards with a step back and setback based building envelope control, in alignment with our update to the rear transition performance standards that Roan spoke about earlier. The guidelines will continue to prioritize access to sunlight on the public realm and will use an impacts-based approach to evaluate shadow impacts. So we're looking to ensure that 5 hours of sunlight can be achieved. And then lastly, we'll also look to reduce stepping along the front facade and encourage the provision of 1 step back above the street wall to promote sustainable building technologies, reduce embodied carbon, as well as construction costs. We're also looking to create a comfortable sense of pedestrian scale and generally limiting street wall heights to 6 stories as opposed to 80% of the right of way, especially since the guidelines will now include buildings on 45-meter rights of way, which would be up to 14 stories. And similarly, providing this maximum street wall height of 6 stories will align with the height maximums provided at the rear, and again, ensure that these stepbacks align with the structure grid and help to contribute to reducing embodied carbon as well. So starting with the first updated guideline for front facade design is sun and shadow performance. Mid-rise buildings should be designed to protect access to sunlight within the surrounding public realm. And the scale and massing of the front facade should ensure access to at least 5 hours of sunlight on the boulevard on the opposite side of the street at the equinoxes. So this can be achieved through a combination of a setback at grade and a step back above the street wall, but the specific hours would be determined based on the orientation of the street. And we've just illustrated east-west streets and north-south streets in the graphics here. However, obviously we have diagonal streets and other orientations, so those hours would vary in that circumstance. Moving on to street wall height, street walls should be designed to fit harmoniously within the existing and/or planned context of neighboring building heights at the street edge and respect the scale and proportion of adjacent streets and open spaces. In absence of an existing street wall height context, heights should be provided at a minimum of 3 stories up to a maximum of 6 stories to maintain the sense of pedestrian scale. We are looking to achieve variation in street wall height, so that is encouraged, and in some cases, the street wall height can extend up to 8 stories to create that variation and add emphasis to focal points on the site or adjacent public realm as well. Next, street proportion and pedestrian perception step back. Good proportion should be achieved by providing a step back above the street wall and a step back from the property line where the combined dimension is generally equal to 20% of the building height. So in this, we're kind of essentially translating the previous 80% angular plane into a step back and setback requirement. So the minimum dimension of the pedestrian perception step back should generally be no less than 3 meters to maintain legibility and prominence of the street wall and create opportunities for terraces of a sufficient depth as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we are looking to encourage 1 step back above the street wall and hoping that this would align with the structure grid of the building and simplify the overall massing to, again, limit embodied carbon and energy inefficiencies, as we've mentioned earlier. As well, there should be consideration for the dimension of the setback at grade, would require evaluation of existing and planned context, the character of the streetscape and the permitted uses, as well as consideration for the other guidelines, which I'll go over momentarily. Next, street wall design. So street walls should be designed to support the adjacent public realm through well-articulated and appropriately scaled facades. So this guideline will acknowledge the important role that we all know the street wall plays in creating the backdrop for the public realm and animating the street. It will include guidance related to cultural heritage as well and how to respect heritage properties and create comfortable yet highly animated pedestrian environments. Sustainability will also be incorporated by ensuring that bio-based high-quality solid materials such as stone and brick are used to contribute to the human-scaled public realm, and also ensure a maximum of 60% glazed area for ground floors and commercial frontages and a maximum of 40% glazed area for residential facades is provided in order to reduce operational emissions as well. So with that, I'll move on to the rear transition updates, which Rowan had mentioned is the catalyst to this entire update of the consolidated guidelines. So I'll just go over the key points and the updates since what Rowan already covered at the beginning of the presentation. So the updated rear transition guidelines do not use an angular plane. They use a setback and step back based approach to reduce stepping and promote sustainable building technologies, as we mentioned. The intent is to minimize perceived impacts of developments on surrounding areas while maintaining access to light, views, and privacy, while delivering on the city's intensification and expanding housing options objectives. So key updates since the initial draft include the provision of a 6-meter setback from parks where active uses are proposed. And that's to provide sufficient space for a boulevard with a pedestrian clearway and landscaping, essentially treating that rear edge like a frontage fronting onto the park. And then lastly, we're also including additional guidelines for buildings of 12 to 14 stories. So obviously addressing that increase up to 45-meter right-of-ways and 45-meter tall buildings, which would include an additional 2.5-meter step back at the rear above the 11th story. So as you can see in these illustrations here, the rear transition between mid-rise buildings and abutting buildings to the rear should be created through a combination of building heights, horizontal separation, setbacks and or step backs of the upper floors, landscaping, as well as facade articulation. So this rear transition should be achieved by providing a minimum setback of 7.5 meters from the rear property line to the building face. For buildings up to 6 stories, there's no requirement for rear step backs. Buildings between 7 and 11 stories should introduce a 2.5-meter step back between the 3rd and 7th story. And the height of that step back should be determined by evaluating the existing and planned context to respond appropriately. And then lastly, for buildings between 12 and 14 stories, as I just mentioned, an additional 2.5-meter step back should be introduced above the 11th story, as you can see here. And then lastly, on corner sites where there's no opportunity for a rear lane, the rear setback may be reduced to 2.5 meters for the portion of the building that fronts onto that side street to create a continuous street wall. And then the space between the building and the property line can be used for landscaping. And in this particular situation, the wing element would be no greater than 4 stories and have no primary windows facing the shared property line. So since the initial rear transition update, city staff have made sure that the transition between mid-rise buildings and all other building types is consistent. So transition between mid-rise, low-rise, other mid-rise and high-rise are all the same as the guidelines that I just mentioned a moment ago. However, for tall buildings and mid-rise buildings, there's additional guidelines for minimum separation distances, where 15 meters should be provided between buildings up to a height of 6 stories, 20 meters for buildings up to 11 stories, and then 25 meters for buildings taller than 11 stories up to 14 stories. Moving on to transition to parks and open spaces. So again, this transition should maximize access to sunlight, minimize shadow impacts, create comfortable wind conditions through a combination of setbacks and stepbacks. We're looking at 2 general approaches to rear transition here. The first being where there is rear access along the park edge, and the second where there is an active edge. So the transition for mid-rise buildings with access at the rear would provide a 10-meter setback from the property line to allow for vehicular access, as well as a 2.5-meter landscaped area. And then where there is no vehicular access along the rear and the lower portions of the building should provide an active edge at grade. That setback would be reduced to 6 meters minimum, and that's to provide sufficient space for sidewalks and landscaping and create a boulevard condition along the park. So rear transition for shallow sites. The purpose of this guideline here is to really unlock the development potential of shallow sites that would not be able to meet the rear transition standards, but would otherwise be appropriate for mid-rise development. So in order to do this, consideration will be given to expanding the site to include additional properties to the rear to enable that development, while adhering to all front, rear, and side setbacks and stepbacks. So as you can see in this table here, this consideration would be given to achieving the ideal lot depth to provide a functional building on these sites. And this guideline is presented as one solution to developing mid-rise buildings on shallow properties and may not be applicable in all circumstances. So moving on to side yard setbacks, some of the key updates for the guidelines include greater recognition of design considerations for pavilion buildings, so 4-sided buildings, and non-avenue contexts where more porosity and landscaping is desirable. Also considerations that are more flexible for narrow sites, including reduced stepbacks at upper stories, light wells, notched elevations, and other design options. And then lastly, clarifying requirements for various facing conditions. So situations where there's no windows, secondary windows, primary windows, and primary windows on long facades perpendicular to the street. So as it relates to continuous street walls, the guidelines will continue to encourage that buildings are generally built to the side property lines to create continuous facades and avoid blank side walls. However, mid-rise buildings in residential contexts that require greater separation between buildings should be set back from property lines and provide windows on all elevations, provide a porous street wall, and opportunities for landscaping as well. And we've just illustrated those various conditions in the images on the screen here. So side step backs at upper stories, these should be provided above the street wall to create breaks between new and existing or multiple new mid-rise buildings, providing sky views and increased sunlight access to the sidewalk. Generally, this is consistent in the approach of the existing performance standards, where the continuous street wall can be built to the property line and then primary windows provided above, so long as there's a 5.5 meter step back from the property line. And that's just illustrated in various conditions here, where you could have a continuous street wall or a more porous street wall with a pavilion type building, where that 5.5 meter step back would be required from grade as well. Also in the update, we want to continue to enable development of smaller sites. So considering some flexibility where reduced stepbacks may be provided above the street wall if impacts on the surrounding context are limited and the redevelopment potential of adjacent properties is also contemplated. So we're illustrating here some alternative design solutions, such as light wells, notched elevations, which may be considered in order to provide access to daylight for residential units. Blank sidewalls, regarding blank sidewalls, the guidelines will continue to discourage them. We're looking to mitigate blank side walls and ensure they're designed with a material finish that complements the architectural character of the main building facades, and also recognize that they do provide an opportunity to provide visual interest when viewed from the public realm. So they should incorporate high quality design treatments such as green walls, murals, or other facade enhancements where appropriate, such as this example here from Kensington Market. For side windows, mid-rise buildings should provide side yard setbacks that appropriately respond to the facing conditions of the budding properties. Existing buildings with side wall windows should not be negatively impacted by these new developments. So specifically, they should be designed with regard for the existing and planned condition of the abutting properties. In determining appropriate side yard setbacks, consideration should be given to the redevelopment potential and the facing conditions in both the present and the future. So this table here summarizes the setbacks that the guidelines would be looking for depending on that condition. So where primary windows are located alongside elevations, a minimum setback of 5.5 meters should be provided from the side property line. And for mid-rise buildings that are oriented perpendicular to the street with long side elevations, so kind of similar to a rear yard condition, a minimum setback of 7.5 meters should be provided from the side property line. And then lastly, for mid-rise buildings that are 20 meters in height or less, 6 stories or less, the side yard setback may be reduced to 2.4 meters where no primary windows are located along the side elevations. So that is consistent with EHON major streets, as Rowan mentioned earlier. For side street setbacks, mid-rise buildings should be set back along the side streets to provide transition to adjacent residential properties with front yard setbacks. So this setback should extend for a portion of the frontage with a minimum of 2 meters to a maximum of 5 meters. Except where residential uses are proposed at grade, a setback of 3 meters should be provided along the side street to accommodate a landscape buffer and provide private outdoor amenity space to provide a transition between the public and private realm as well. So with that, I'll move on to section 4.0, which is the pedestrian realm. The key updates here focus on highlighting sustainability and aligning the guidelines with other public realm and streetscape initiatives in the city, all those that have been introduced since the inception of the original performance standards. So some of these key updates include increasing the minimum sidewalk zone to 6 meters on all street rights of way, just to promote an enhanced public realm and align with the tall building design guidelines as well. And also we're looking to renew our focus on sustainability, safety, and accessibility for the streetscape design, and ensuring alignment with TGS, green infrastructure standards, as well, just to make sure that they're all considered from the outset of the design process. So as I mentioned, mid-rise buildings should be set back at grade to provide a minimum sidewalk zone of 6 meters. The pedestrian clearway should be a minimum of 2.1 meters and should be located away from the curb to ensure the safety and comfort of pedestrians. A 2.5 meter minimum furnishing and planting zone is encouraged to provide sufficient space for tree planting and support the growth of mature trees and other pedestrian amenities as well. And also we're considering wider sidewalk zones, which may be required on major streets or other transit corridors to accommodate increased pedestrian traffic and transit infrastructure as well. For streetscaping, mid-rise buildings should provide vibrant pedestrian-oriented streetscapes with the highest level of urban design treatment to create beautiful, comfortable, sustainable, safe, and accessible pedestrian environments and great places to shop, work, and live for all. So the guidelines want to ensure that streetscapes follow the classifications, placement guidelines, and design details in the Urban Design Streetscape Manual. Also, tree planting strategies should ensure that sustainable conditions for growth of mature trees are provided, and also that existing mature trees are preserved wherever possible. Also, just generally looking to maximize tree planting opportunities within the public realm, minimize utility conflicts by coordinating and relocating above and below grade utilities to accommodate tree planting opportunities as well, just to ensure that we're meeting complete street objectives and as well as our target for 40% tree canopy cover. So I think with that, yep.
I'm sorry to butt in. At the moment, you have about a minute left, but I have a sense that you're probably going to need more than a minute for the things that you have remaining. How much more time do you need?
If we could have maybe 5 more minutes, that would be great. If not, I can try to run through the last few slides quickly.
No, let's aim for 5 more minutes.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So just lastly, moving on to site organization updates. So these are just kind of a high-level overview of some of the updates. As we know that we're tight for time, there's many other updates we would like to discuss, but we're just going to highlight public and private open space and connections firstly. So this update to the guidelines will introduce these general site planning principles into the guidelines, just to be consistent with tall building and low-rise guidelines, as Roan mentioned earlier, and to ensure that these principles are considered in the design of mid-rise buildings. Similarly, we also want to promote the inclusion of open space and landscape mid-block connections on mid-rise sites, and we want to make sure that these are creating livable communities that are supported by a variety of amenities and open spaces. So generally, mid-rise buildings should provide grade-related publicly accessible open spaces. They should connect and extend to the existing network of public streets, parks, and open spaces. They should provide a range of high-quality, comfortable, private, and shared outdoor amenity spaces as well. And then lastly, comfortable, safe, accessible pedestrian and cycling routes throughout the mid-rise building site to connect to adjacent routes as well as priority destinations such as transit, for example. So on the screen here, these are some examples of the types of spaces that we've seen in mid-rise buildings across the city, where they're also used to soften the edge of the site and also create the transition to adjacent neighborhoods as well. And then lastly, we're just going to touch briefly on site access, servicing, and parking. So some of the key updates here that are worth highlighting are the need to provide design considerations for small scale mid-rise buildings with curbside garbage pickup, where garbage pickup is ideally dealt with internal to the site to ensure it does not obstruct the pedestrian clearway or conflict with tree planting. Also, the need to emphasize the desire to consolidate access where possible and maximize the landscaping and limit impacts on the public realm. And then lastly, incorporate guidance for the provision of accessible parking spaces as well as EV infrastructure. So just looking generally here at site access design principles, where mid-rise buildings should locate loading, servicing, utilities, and access to vehicular parking within the building mass or away from the primary frontage and screened from the public realm and public view. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key aspects we're looking to get your input on here is related to curbside pickup for small scale buildings. We know this is a challenge that was brought up with EHAN major streets, and it will be also a challenge with small scale mid-rise. With no real resolutions at this time. So the design guidance that we're proposing in the guideline update is in anticipation of the need for a large number of bins on some of these sites. So we're just looking to ensure that these bins do not impede the provision of an unobstructed pedestrian clearway or interfere with our tree planting objectives as well. So I think with that, I can move on to issues for design focus. So firstly, we're just looking to get your thoughts on, do the key updates in the Consolidated Mid-Rise Guidelines meet the objectives of encouraging mid-rise developments that are more economical to build and more environmentally sustainable? And lastly, as I just mentioned, do you have any suggestions on loading, servicing, and parking for small-scale mid-rise buildings? So thank you for listening to our presentation, and I will turn it back over to Gord.
Great, thanks to both of you for the presentation. What we're going to do now is questions of clarification. So panel members, if you have a question, if you have a statement, save it for the comments. If you have a question of clarification, this is your moment. So raise your virtual hand. We'll start with Heather.
Thank you. One quick question. I think curbside pickup is allowed for developments that are 30 units and less, if I'm not mistaken. I'm just wondering what the history of that rule is. Does it have to do with size of truck or capacity or average amount of garbage for 30 units? I'm just wondering where that came from.
So to answer your question, this guideline, like for the garbage pickup, was set by the solid waste management in the city, and 30 units under, they can absolutely ask for the curbside pickup. It has to deal with the number of the bins and their typical residential bins for the curbside pickup. Due to the machine lifting purpose, they automated like the lifting for the curbside pickup. And recently, the solid waste management has provided some flexibility on the guidelines, allow the units up to 60, the building up to 60 units. If deemed appropriate, then they can also get the curbside pickup. So that's what's has been those units, up to 60 units. Those mid-rise, small scale mid-rise or EHAN major streets is typology development. Will probably have some have curbside pickup allowed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll move on then to Ralph, Meg, and Olivia. Ralph.
Couple of questions. One on diagram 131, the site planning for deep and large sites. doesn't really matter the specific page, but on corner lots, you have graphically shown on this drawing a tighter setback on the street, and then on the side street, a larger setback. Yeah, on the left-hand side. I'm just wondering why the larger setback on the smaller street, given that there's still transition between the step back and the neighborhood to the bottom of the page. That's one question. The second question has to do with I'm kind of really confused about 323 step street proportion and pedestrian perception step back. If you can go to that one, 323. Just gonna ask all three questions quickly. And, there, like, 6 meter front setback, 7.2, 9 meter step backs are enormous. And just wondering if there is any consideration for the typical double loaded building depth that's cut off in this diagram, and why you need such large step backs when the right of ways are so much larger. It's a kind of question. I just don't understand the logic of this. And then the last question had to do with on parks. This rear transition to parks where, you know, we could actually take advantage of the park department only requires a 5 meter step back to their park. Why? I understand on the left-hand side where there's a driveway and a lane, but I don't quite understand it. And in all fairness, this diagram, this image on the right, that sidewalk's actually on public park. I believe the property line is the chain link, the fence line you can see in the foreground. And so I don't quite understand why on earth we would ask for a 10 meter step back on a park when parks only requires 5 meters, and you can get more, you can turn the building and make an L-shaped building towards the park and gain potential. And here you have the step back shown quite large on the 36 meter right of way. I guess that goes by your chart. And I'm just going to say did you account for the depth of these buildings and what the upper building is? Because clearly this is one of the problems, I think, is that you're getting these funny proportions of building base and then a building on top if you need to deliver more housing and more density. So that goes to the second question, I guess. So if you can answer those three.
I guess I will go to the first two and I let Alexis address the third one. So the first question, Ralph, you're quite right pointing out that diagram. The diagram needs to be further enhanced as we are still like in the middle of this revision. And as Alexis actually added her presentation on the setback on the side street, so it depends on the use of the ground floor. So if it's a retail use, carry on around the corner, of course, the property, like the building could be closer to the property line, and then provided that transition to the adjacent neighborhood the house further to the south.
No, I'm sorry. I'm meaning the step back at the top of the above the podium. Above the podium.
The step back above the podium.
Yeah, it's not dimensioned, and therefore, and yet it looks like it's the same as the 5.5 meter on the other side.
It could be similar as the front step back, the 3 meters. So we can clarify that the side street, yeah. So it would be similar on that. Then to address your second question in terms of this 20%, that's is the overall the setback plus the step back. So I think your concern is really on like a very large, wider streets. You actually like based on that calculation is 9 meters together with the setback plus the step back. We did think about the dimension of the double load corridor building and think about if we want to have a more like a generous landscape on the street frontage. You for example, you have the 3-meter step back on the 14th story, or 6 meters. 6 meters sometimes actually align the structure grade. It's actually helped to reduce the embodied carbon for the building. When you go has this one step back, go up. That's actually could work to get this envelope, like at the upper level of the building. You probably have a narrow double loaded corridor building width, and at the bottom the base building would have a larger depth. But that's actually helps to result like get a 5-hour sunlight on the public streets, and also helps to result to have a double row of trees, especially in those large, like very wide streets. There exist in the city, like some parts of the Steeles Avenue, some parts of the Dufferin streets. So those kind of double row of trees with extensive landscapes helps for those sites to have some amenity space for the pedestrians and for the residents living in those mid-rise buildings. And then I move to ask Alexis to answer the third one. Yeah.
Thanks, Roan. So regarding your question about rear changes into parks, this is actually something that we've discussed quite a bit through our internal workshops. So I think everyone's well aware that Parks is looking for a minimum 5 meters for maintenance. But we are really trying to set an urban design standard. We don't really want it to be driven by Parks maintenance requirements. So when we were thinking of the rationale for why we want to have 6 meters from the park is to really treat it as if we would treat a street frontage. We want to have enhanced public realm along the park just as much as we do along the street. So that's where our rationale for the 6 meters setback came from.
Sorry, 6 meters?
6 meters, yep. So, sorry if it's not clearly indicated in the diagram here. So 10 meters would be if there's rear access, and 6 meters is if there would be no rear access. So the building would be fronting directly onto the park. My apologies for not including that on the slide.
Okay, I gotcha. Okay.
Okay. So, Ralph, has that answered your questions?
Yeah, and I understand that this is still ongoing, these diagrams, so I appreciate that.
Yeah. This is great, the sheer amount of information and the depth of study that's taken place here. I'm going to move on to Meg and then Olivia.
I mean, thanks so much, and thanks for the presentation. What was the process in the summer? Like were there structural engineers and architects involved? How did it happen?
You mean for this consolidated mid-rise guidelines?
Yes.
We were directed by the Planning Housing Committee, basically in the November 2023. That was when we sent the feedback on the like industry and the public consultation feedback to the Planning Housing Committee, and the Planning Housing Committee directed us to do this consolidated mid-rise guideline, basically taking the current mid-rise performance standards and also combine with the 2016 monitoring, the comments feedback, and also combining with the public and the stakeholder feedback, and consolidate them to review and analyze, update the mid-rise guidelines. So we have been consulted with the industry, like mass timber industry, with the Crateo on the mass timber project, and we also consult build, and those are the public stakeholder consultation we held. And
so no architects or engineers?
We have we consult Intelligent City. They are the, I guess they are the industry engineers working on mass timber project.
Okay, so I think the answer to my question is really no. Can you go to page 30, slide 31? Couple of very specific questions. How is the building height affected if the lot depths vary with the right of way? Like if there's a 20-meter right of way with a lot depth of 34 meters, is a maximum is the maximum height 6 stories, or can it be more based on the intent of the massing diagram?
I think that the intent of the massing diagram shows if you like doing this 1-to-1 ratio, that's the 6th story. Then you on the 20-meter right of way, you're sorry, did I understand it? This you
Like,
talk about the lot depth.
Is it prescriptive basically?
As the beginning at the building height section, I think we also mentioned there's a large, deep, and the large lots, and if you meet other policy and other guidelines mentioned,
Okay,
and
thank
then
you, Ron.
could, yeah.
One other question, page 46, or slide 46.
Do you mind just including the heading of the slide? I think our numbers
Oh,
might be
sure,
slightly different.
333.
333. Thank you so much.
Why the additional step back at the 11th and 12th story?
Yeah, as we start to increase the building height, it's just the proportionally feels it's needed to get that additional step back to create a more separation distance between between the buildings, and that's just provided that kind of better transition. I think that's
Okay, it's complicated. It makes it more complicated, just as an FYI, but I'll talk about that in the comments. Thank you. That's it for me.
Okay, then we'll move on to Olivia and then Eladia.
Hopefully this is a quick one. You mentioned that there's now a maximum 40% glazing for residential floors. Is there any change to glazing requirements for the ground level? Or is that, I think that's still at 60% minimum? Is that correct?
Alexis?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is something we're still working on refining. We want to make sure that we're including findings from the city's embodied carbon study, which do indicate that 50% is a better ratio there. So in this current draft, we had 60%, but I think that's something that we're looking at considering, and we welcome your input on as well.
Thank you.
Okay, all right, and last but not least, Eladia.
Hi, I just wonder if you could repeat what you said. I don't know, I just didn't absorb it. I had the same question as Ralph regarding connectivity to parks on 3.3.2.
Yep, no problem. Just let me pull this slide back up. So the approach to rear transition to parks is really considering two different conditions. So the first condition would be if there's rear access occurring along the edge of the park. So in that condition, we would be looking for a 10-meter setback from the property line to the building face. That would be 7.5 meters for access, and then 2.5 meters for a landscaped buffer between the park. And then in the second condition, where there would be no rear access and the building would be fronting onto the park, that setback would be 6 meters instead, and that would be treating it as a boulevard the same way we would treat it along a street. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and so the diagrams are just not fully accurate. Like the line appears to be the far side of a sidewalk there, but
so in these two diagrams would be showing the condition where there would be rear access, whether it is a driveway or a lane. We're still working on refining a lot of the visuals for the consolidation of the guidelines. So we just have an image at this time illustrating the front or the condition where there would be an active frontage on the park. So as you can see here, this example, this is on King Street West. There would be residential units at grade, and then the setback would be 6 meters to include a pedestrian clearway as well as landscaping.
Okay, thank
you.
Sorry,
It's Ralph. Alexa, is that because the park, like in this case, the walkways, the pedestrian walkways on the park?
Mm-hmm.
Like you would, it just seems a lot to ask of a building to create a 6 meter setback and a walkway that may not be contiguous.
Maybe we can take that into the comments that you make. How's that sound? Okay, I think we've gone through the questions. So I'm going to suggest we move into panel comments. We spend a little bit more time presenting the document. I'm going to suggest we have 9 people. Try 2.5 minutes per person. If we have some time left over at the end, then we'll circle back with any further comments. So 2.5 minutes per person. Self-manage your time. We're going to start with Heather, Meg, and then Ralph, and then go to Aledia, Jim Goff, Jim Melvin, Dima, Olivia, and Joe. So we'll start with Heather.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I think you're going to get many comments here. Just want to thank you for bringing this forward. This is an already challenged typology for developers. And so to be able to encourage people to take on building this kind of typology, I think that we need to allow room to maneuver. Otherwise, I mean, we all can agree that this scale of project is actually much loved. I think it's buildings of this scale continue to win awards. I think it's in part because it's relatable. It's a relatable size to most people. They can see themselves living there. These are, small communities that are closer to the streets and neighborhoods. And so I think we really, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we can continue to build this scale. So just starting on some specific comments, I'm not sure that I buy kind of separation distances related to uses. I didn't see that happen too many times in what was presented today, but like office, the distance between office use and residential. I think as a society, we're really encouraging buildings to be adaptively reused, and there's no guarantee that that's, an office building is going to remain an office building. So I think I think we should think about that a little bit more. I'm worried that some of the moves are actually moving in the wrong direction. Specifically, the greater clearway dimension on the street, 6 meters and more. To me, I think is kind of squeezing sites that are already very difficult to develop. I think Ralph's recent questions too, probing that park setback. I think that's putting a lot of burden on already very difficult to develop sites. I think also providing larger sidewalk and pedestrian clearway dimensions sometimes does not work in our favor. We don't want these areas to be big enough to drive a vehicle on. And also we've seen all these new modes of transportation. If you give a big sidewalk, cyclists are going to start using it as well. So I think really, tuning those dimensions is important. I see some contradictions here in this document about, you've asked us to look at this with respect to building sustainably, you know, providing these 2-floor cantilevered volumes over a site that's managed to get an additional site next to it. I don't know too many developers who are going to build those. Also, it's just not sustainable to build in that way. You know, the envelope is going on all, you know, 4 sides of that bit that you're building out. And then also the increased setbacks that you're asking for near the top of the building. I mean, it really gets to affect the usability of those floor plate sizes. So we have to always kind of keep that in mind. Some of the easy gives with respect to smaller setbacks near the tops of buildings, I would encourage even more of those because they don't really affect shadow impact at all. It's really just the perceived kind of transition. So I think it was mentioned earlier, but any kind of setbacks with mass timber construction are really difficult, in some cases near impossible to provide. So hopefully less setbacks, less cantilevers really encourage that method of construction. I think there is something to be unlocked here with respect to this study, these guidelines, being more in tune with the character areas studies, because I do think that this typology really can lead to very bespoke solutions. So again, giving more room to maneuver and then having the character area actually govern over some of those decisions. For instance, I know in Downsview, the rezoning that's happened there were exceptions made with respect to right-of-way distances and heights. You know, specifically with an eye to a kind of more European scaled feeling street. And so there may be some areas within, you know, cities where that is a better solution that works better in that particular character area. I also just want to say this, the variation in street wall height, I'm not sure that always applies, and I'm not sure I actually agree with that, because I think there is beauty and calmness in repetition in some circumstances. And again, I'm thinking of European cities. So yeah, those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. On to Meg and then Ralph.
Thanks so much. I agree 100% with Heather. I think she said it really succinctly and clearly and helpfully at the beginning. This is a very challenged building typology in Toronto. It's not a pretty one. I don't agree that some of the precedent, with all due respect, that some of the precedents that you put there are what we should be aiming for in the long run. They were not, you know, they're not economical. In some cases, they're not like they're not great places to live because they're challenged in the way that the layouts had to be because of the setbacks and the guidelines. Room to maneuver is key. To quote Heather, again, well said. It's confounding to me that architects and engineers were not engaged to test the guidelines. The massings don't reflect the reality. I'm going to be a little bit blunt here. They don't reflect the reality of structure, construction, or cost. To answer your question, or to respond to the question, do the changes make the buildings more economical and sustainable? Probably not. At a high level, and I'll address more granular issues later, rather than small incremental changes, the small incremental changes contemplated here, which in many instances, like I said, won't make more beautiful buildings or nice streets or places to live, the city should be looking holistically at how these guidelines are impacting other important initiatives like building housing more quickly, EHON, and increasing sustainability targets, TGS, as well as its impact on costs and therefore housing affordability. Said another way, these guidelines appear to be at odds, or in some cases, not aligned with other city priorities, as well as, like I said before, the realities of construction and costs. Like Heather's, I think further to what Heather said, and given the current market conditions, and we don't see those abating anytime soon, nor do I think we should assume they might in the future, our developer clients are pausing projects because the numbers just don't work. Restrictive guidelines and approvals processes only exacerbate this condition. So at a more granular level, setbacks. It's hard to understate the importance of eliminating upper setbacks. It's like eliminating them will unlock more opportunities to use mass timber and other prefabricated systems, which will, has the potential to reduce cost and therefore produce affordability. And at the same time, provide a compact form that reduces embodied carbon, i.e. we want fewer structural transfers, not more. Well, I mean, we want to eliminate as many as possible. And this is conducive to improved building envelope performance and a stepping stone to meeting passive house standards. We can't do that now. This would also make it easier to meet CMHC financing requirements, which might be the tipping point to make these projects financially viable for more developers. Page 43, I'm sorry, I don't have the section header for that. I could get it. It's 3 point something. Side step backs shouldn't be automatic. They complicate, as previously noted, mass timber structural systems, and in some cases make upper floors too narrow to be viable. They also mean that the exit stair shafts need to be set in from the ends, which in many cases will result in an inefficient floor layout, which has a cost and again a livability impact. Further to this, stepping back in two directions at corner sites complicates the structural layout, particularly in frame systems, which again, that means like mass timber and structural steel, and encourages concrete buildings, concrete and tower crane. Now, having said that, concrete can be cost prohibitive for small mid-rises, which is something we've seen in our practice. An important note about slide 42, aligning with the structural grid. The step backs are not of the same scale as a steel or timber structural grid. The city needs to revisit this item as the assumption it's made here is incorrect. Yes, and sorry, I'm reading off my notes. So, if the city is firm on this policy, which is to say the step backs, it has to be aware of the implications on construction and the added floor-to-floor heights for the structural transfers that need to be accommodated. Removing the rear angular plane is certainly a step in the right direction. This was a highly problematic policy and in some cases was very literally enforced. Moving away from this as a tool to define built form is very welcome. Allowing for rear transition lots like we had on a project on Eglinton at Caledonia is significant and could unlock sites that are currently too shallow for a reasonable floor plate. It requires an OPA, but this is generally a straightforward process, provided the site needs rezoning anyway. Page 53, the small setback to a line, I forget what section that is, but it's where you set it back to on a side street to align with the setback to the single family houses. It complicates, this is a note again on complication. It complicates the building structure, the design of the building, the unit layout, and the architecture unnecessarily for little to my mind or to no benefit. Page 55, 6 meter wide sidewalks are great, but keep in mind this means that the front yard setback could be 2 to 3 meters in some cases, or in many cases. 30-meter deep lots would take a big hit. So you take the 30 meters minus the 3 meters minus the 7.5 is a 19.5 meter building depth. And if you include another step back on the upper floors, the floors just likely won't work. Also, the 19.5 meter depth will make the ground floor difficult due to the loading ramp. And ramp. There's not much left. Further to this, urban design policy to encourage great retail should be discussed. 6 meter sidewalk is good and allows for patios. However, ideally, retail has a minimum 40-foot depth, which can be a challenge in mid-rise, and as the residential requirements come first in setting the location of the core and the structure. Page 57. Urban design should focus on guidelines that make the public realm and sidewalks beautiful. This means focusing on high quality architecture and facades that make retail viable and welcoming. This including consideration of how the building touches the ground, and that should be a focus, not just on how it rises to the sky. Signage strategy for retail should be studied and proposed, so it's not an afterthought. Exhaust shafts should be located away from the public realm wherever possible, and gas meters should be positioned in discrete locations, off laneways, and screened or recessed. This is always an issue with Enbridge as their policies keep changing. I would suggest city urban design should work with utilities like TO, Hydro, and Enbridge to influence them to make changes to their policies and standards. And the second question, which was on garbage, I think, yeah, and loading. For small mid-rise, which is 50 to 100 units, type G loading can be next to impossible to achieve, particularly when the city requires it to be enclosed within the building. There's an exemption for type G up to 60 units. The city needs to consider smaller trucks, garbage trucks, easier to adapt a truck to the city than adapting a city to a truck, or street pickup, more frequent pickup, and or more nuanced policy in our garbage pickup system, as this problem is not going away. That's it for me. Sorry for rushing.
Well, thank you. And maybe, Meg, given the degree of work that you've done, it'd be interesting to hand maybe a copy over to Leanne so we can get that included.
For sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much. On to Ralph and then Ladia.
Well, clearly between Heather and Meg, you kind of hear the exasperated pleas of people that are battling on these typologies every day. It's kind of odd, I'd be honest, that there is an incredible, I'm going to say, wealth of goodwill, I think, within the architectural community that probably could have informed this document. And I want to start by saying it is an unenviable position to write this because it's so challenging. And I appreciate the ambition of not just the typology, but also public realm and sustainability and all the elements. But I do think that I want to kind of just warn everybody that if it ends up being not well used or debated or pushed, then we're back to the drawing board. And I do think that Meg and Heather and myself, all of us actually probably on this call dealt with mid-rise buildings where we're battling on everything. And we're battling the interpretation of a guideline to battling construction departments within our clients' organizations to deliver something. And it really is challenging. As much as Heather said, it's everybody loves mid-rise, and we want mid-rise, but we can't deliver mid-rise. And I'm worried that I think we're looking through a pure planning and urban design lens, and it's going to get tripped up at the implementation. The fact that you're not drawing a section of a building in completion to actually see that it cannot be delivered, its inefficiency will be completely useless to actually deliver with setbacks that are a kind of formula of a public realm and a massing element, I think is really too much. And I think we kind of step back a little bit. I also think that, these numbers of 80%, I mean, how many of our projects we're battling our clients to create 9-10 foot ground floors for retail because they don't want to lose a floor on the height is completely odd. And when we go and talk to certain city staff, well, you lose a floor, so in order to do a good retail podium or even an entry level. So it is these little things that there are 1,000 cuts and they add up to something that is a stillbirth, and that is not what these guidelines should be. And I think there's a tone of it that sounds prescriptive, and I think that maybe needs to kind of just be reworked so that it's still within a guideline lens. Because I think if they're read as prescriptive, downstream, all the teams that are going to be looking at this document and judging a project are going to be looking at it literally. And I think that that's really always a dangerous situation, specifically with a guideline. I mentioned the ground floor. That's a small one, 6 stories, so it's 86% of the right of way. Like, you get a better ground floor, it just seems so prescriptive. Just in Barcelona 2 weeks ago, the most beautiful little trucks, garbage trucks, it's unbelievable that nobody has broken the fiefdom of waste at the city that we have to still deal with type G technology. It just is beyond me that that is not the case. Or we're at, I think we're more than 30 units now. I think we're up to 50, I think, in the major streets. I think they're looking at that. But again, you know, bins are bigger now. Waste is different than when they decided 30 units 20 years ago. So I think the 5 meters setback for the park, again, it's nice, Alexis, to think as an urban designer that it's a good thing. But again, I think the challenge will be if people just say no to it and it's not being used, or it immediately becomes a difficult document to navigate through. I think it defeats the purpose of it. I can kind of go through a bunch of all these things. I mean, I don't get this sliding scale of I'm just like 45-meter road. Like, maybe we'd be putting high rises on 45-meter right of ways, not mid rises. Like, just, you know, it's just odd that, and then the setback gets even worse. So they're going to say, well, why would I even do a mid rise? Like, it just seems against the logic of the implementation side. And I think I just want to warn you that you can't get it's too important a document to actually not be embraced. You need to be ahead of the industry and not just feel like you're not listening to them. And when I say industry, I'm talking about us too. Like, we're trying to deliver mid-rise, and we need all the tools we can get that can help us convince our clients to do them. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about this. Moving on to Aladia and Jim Goff and Jim Melvin. Aladia.
Just thinking about some solutions that could maybe work. City of Hamilton recently rolled out some densification initiatives. What they did was they paid an honorarium to some architectural firms to run a test build on them. And having run a test build, like a test design, and having run the test design, come back with specific recommendations to simplify the approach. And I thought that was pretty good. I don't know if that got done. I didn't hear if it had. That may be a way for City of Toronto to address some of the simplicity issues. I agree that there's some elements that seem quite complex and quite prescriptive. Like, there's if you're here, then this setback, but also this setback, but also this, but also this, but also this. There's just a lot. And I think what we have to do, especially for the mid-rise where the fees are much lower, being a much smaller project, and it's residential to boot, so the fees are even less. We got to make this super straightforward, very easy to understand at a glance. So lots of helpful tools, so designers have references to existing sets of information that will assist them to make sustainable buildings. So making a lot of what are actually guidelines and not rules, and then giving perhaps maybe some framework of rewards if you itemize what from these tools you are using. So I'm not super up on, how to build a good bylaw for tiny little jobs like this that are going to have limited fees, and the professionals are going to be really challenged, to adhere. But maybe take a look at some of those tools that other jurisdictions are using, and focus more on the carrot and having really good resources available, simple ones that are, easy to understand at a glance. So we're not wasting time on tiny little bites, like, I don't know, like the little tiny setback to the residential zone creates this weird little bite out of the back of the building. That seems very odd on 3.3.3. I agree, like the 11 and 12 story setback seems so minimal as to be like it's not going to make a difference. Same with 3.4.3, that little bite out of the back corner of the building. It just seems like such a small gesture. It's not going to be helpful. It's just going to be adding complexity. I would add a few things in terms of resources. If there's an existing best practice for green space continuity that we can reference as a resource to practitioners, that would be super helpful. And then maybe think up some carrots to help them do that. Because when we link up green spaces, all sorts of good things happen. Continuity of urban habitat zones is really important to support organisms, humans and otherwise. So that should have that should be explicitly mentioned. There should be a resource associated to how best to accomplish that. And there should be some carrots, like some rewards, making things easier for practitioners if they follow that guideline. Same with, I think, we should say in words that our goal is to enhance the viability of plant communities and enhance habitat diversity by encouraging greater continuity of green space and linking habitat zones. I think we need to say that in words. The other thing is, I think we need to say something about orientation to the cardinal directions. So the building facades, when you're saying all these words about making them, animated and beautiful and creating a good public realm, we really should be saying something about how they orient to the sun. So the east and west conditions have low sun angles, and you can create great big solar gains from the east and west facades. The south facade is a great place to accept, solar gains, but control them during the summer. And then the north needs to be treated in a different way because that's diffuse light. So I didn't see anything about cardinal directions. That also really mitigates or it creates different vegetation viabilities. So that is also not reflected. So useful guidelines, less prescriptive, very much more simple, creating resources for practitioners, do some test builds, see what falls out. That would be my recommendations. Sorry for going over.
Okay. Thank you. Moving on to Jim Goff. Jim, you may be on mute.
Sorry. Thanks for the presentation. Just in the interest of time, I am going to give most of my time to the architects on the panel. They obviously need to weigh in and have a lot to say. So just a couple points regarding the size of trucks. I agree completely. We can be more sustainable, more European, more compact, and more livable. Regarding 3.2.3, I agree that the wider the right-of-way, I don't think you want a bigger setback. I think you want more of the sense of enclosure to reinforce to drivers that they should slow down if anyone actually does build a mid-rise there, as Ralph questioned. And with respect to parking and loading access, I don't have any new ideas about how you would handle that. If the standards are going to remain the same, the way you've presented this is quite logical, I think. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Jim Melvin.
That was short, Jim. Thank you very much for your presentation. As the landscape architect, I understand that there's not a lot of space left over on any of these sites for a lot of landscaping, especially if you want to include habitat zones, Lydia. That would take up even more space. But I think first off, I'm glad you're going back to the index and formatting the document with similar city guidelines and standards. So that's a good thing. I think you need more graphics like the sun's shade graphic that was north, south, east, west. They're fairly simple graphics. And I think what I'm hearing from all of the architects, and it was Heather, I believe, who used the word, where was it? She said bespoke architect architecture. And I think that's what this form of residential housing requires. And I believe every architect and any architect that is worth his worth as an architect will be able to bring all of the things that you are asking for as restrictions to this site, to your site development. The architect will be able to do that in quite an innovative and a design conscious way. If the setback is 5.5 rather than 6, I think there has to be that kind of flexibility. And I would put a little more faith in the architects. And the architects, before they even put pen to paper, they look at the context of the situation. And it's context that is going to drive the setbacks, drive the ideas of use and even your garbage pickup. So I think some of this it definitely needs to be an easier read document that would give architects more flexibility. I worry though about the developer who just wants to make money. And I think that again falls to the architects to be the lead person in this design. So once you've got your zoning in place and you use zoning to encourage mid-rise development, then you use, I think Eladius said it, you use little pieces of incentive. If you can use mass timber, we'll allow you, or we'll permit you, because of the building constraints and the material constraints, we'll allow this building to be stretched and elasticized in the dimension you need. So I think I like that you're working on this, but it is, as Ralph said, very difficult to satisfy everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Moving on to Dima, Olivia, and then Joe. Dima.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction because I think the architectural challenges of this are of the document itself have been covered. And just to go back to the question of context, most of these, like in the main streets and sort of the avenues, there is an existing typology in Toronto that pretty much defines all our main streets, and it's that sort of two-story building with the retail on the bottom and that single window or two window on top. And what I would encourage the city is to actually do a study of our existing main streets to understand their character and what of their character should be preserved or works. Because I think one of the challenges, I come from a heritage perspective, is that there's often these development projects are then hit with this need or this direction or this requirement to conserve a lot of this existing main street. And there is no overarching city understanding of what's important and what's not important. And in the idea of removing obstacles or clarifying what work can be done or how work can be done or what is the context that we're building to and that we want to preserve, I think it'd be important for the city to come with a clear direction. So these guidelines are wonderful, but they're really designed currently in a vacuum that does not actually consider the existing character of our streets, and that would be worth it for providing direction to designers and developers, and also for defining what that future context is going to be. Because I think mid-rise is definitely the future direction the city needs to develop, and understanding what our future streets are going to look like and how they deal with the existing buildings that are there is very important. And in that, like further to that, there's no direction in here to giving additions. It assumes demolition of what's there. And I think acknowledging that there are buildings there and some of them will be worth preserving, and giving direction as to how one does an addition and how one adds to these sites in a way that's appropriate should also be part of the mid-drive guidelines, because if we're talking about sustainability, that should also come into consideration, is how do we adaptively reuse some of the sites and typologies that are predominant in the city. Like that two-story typology defines pretty much every main street, no matter what neighborhood you go into, and recognizing that that exists, and how does 1A deal with it? Which ones get kept? Which ones don't get kept? What is the future of our main street? What do we want our future main streets to look like? And how do these mid-rise typologies fit into this future vision of our main streets? Because I think they are very much the future of our main streets, but I think we need to acknowledge what's there, how that transition is going to work, and where do we want to end up, and identify which parts we keep, and if we keep them, how do we add to them? And this document feels very much in this kind of in a vacuum that does not really acknowledge the existing character of the city and the existing constraints of sites. So I would encourage an overarching study to understand our main streets a little better and see how this would fit in. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tima. Olivia, and then Joe.
Thank you. I just want to express my appreciation for the amount of work that's been done. I know you're juggling many different concerns. I've sort of been following this from the embodied carbon standpoint, and I think the removal of the angular planes, as much as you've pushed it, is huge. And I know I agree with other panel members that you can go further, but this is great progress to see. I'm thinking about the TGS, because to me that's a very successful piece of policy, and the way that it's structured is perhaps in a direction that is less prescriptive. There's a few requirements that are absolute requirements, and there's a bunch of options, and you don't have to hit all of them. And I wonder if that's sort of a guideline for a structure that may be a bit more forgiving. And I want to echo other comments to not be afraid of height. And I think you seem very tentative with that sort of additional step back requirement at the 11-story point. And I think that one of the problems may be that there's such a public perception that height is a problem. And I think we all know there are other ways that buildings can make the ground plane livable, and not just by addressing height. So I think we're sort of concerned about this level because on the one hand, we want to be building more housing, and then our building codes have just been altered to allow for mass timber to go up to 18 stories. So that's sort of beyond the range of this study, but that sort of 11 to 18 story height, I think we have to be very careful to make sure we're not disincentivizing it, because that's sort of exactly what we need. If we look to the city of Vancouver, they're allowing for 2 to 3 additional stories on mass timber buildings that are 8 to 13 stories. So I think that's sort of an indication that there are other ways to achieve a livable mid-rise building. I think maybe more focus on the articulation of the ground floor and porosity. We talked a little bit about the amount of glazing. I wonder if you can sort of rely on TGS and the sort of upcoming requirements for energy and embodied carbon. I think they will already sort of prescribe a minimum amount of glazing, and perhaps you don't need to add that sort of minimum on top of that. And then finally, I wonder what the plan is for follow-up. If you do have to hit that December 2024 deadline, what are the next steps? Are you going to continue to monitor and get reactions from the industry in order to allow this process to be a bit more dynamic? Are there sort of pilot projects that are planned? Is there a feedback loop in order to continue informing the process? Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Last but not least, Joe.
Thank you, Gord. So I have a few suggestions. I think we've received a great amount of really helpful feedback. A few observations first, and then some suggestions. My favorite mid-rise street in the city is Stewart Street, which many of you will know, just south of King West on the west side of the city, west of Bathurst, and a street that more or less goes up 6 stories and is near, I think provides some great examples. My worst example of mid-rise development is in the same neighborhood, and it's by a really prominent architect. Saucier & Perrot did one of the worst projects in the city with a really progressive developer, Freed, at 629 Queen West. 14 stories straight up off the street on the south side. Just destroyed the street. King West. Just destroyed the street. So there's the best and the worst. We have lots of great examples. We have a great history of mid-rise development that we should be learning from. And I appreciate that staff have tried to incorporate examples in their work. I'm just saying, I'm not sure you've gone far enough. I think we need, so, you know, I have a Ukrainian father and a German mother. And so because of that, I think Berlin. And so when it comes to mid-rise, I think Berlin. With respect to garbage pickup and the whole topic, Meg Ryan may or may not remember the Beautiful City Roundtable under Mayor Miller some many years ago. And a significant report, a subcommittee of that panel made, which I chaired, on adjusting guidelines for the development of our city at a kind of microscopic or granular level. And one of those included looking at Amsterdam and looking at the size of garbage trucks, for example. And that rather than the city adjusting to the size of garbage truck sizes, the garbage truck sizes adjust to the scale of the city that we want. And so without repeating everything that everyone said, there's a lot of great comments, like 9-meter setback, really? That's way too much. It's not useful, it's not practical. Simplification is the major theme I've been hearing about through the conversations, through the conversation today. The one thing I haven't heard about, which is also quite relevant, is the length of mid-rise development. That is actually a really important component. It's really hard to make a really long building work well. I think we need to talk about that. But here's my primary suggestion. There's an incredible wealth of talent on this panel that has produced some really great mid-rise design. And appreciating what everyone on the staff has done so far, I would strongly, strongly recommend we establish a public workshop, potentially available on YouTube as soon as possible. And we ask members of this panel to present representative mid-rise development and some of the issues that those mid-rise developments present, with recommendations about the policy implications that flow. And that prior to city staff completing their report, that this public presentation from the feedback of incredibly talented and qualified members of the design review panel bring forward in an organized session over, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, whatever it might be, help inform how these guidelines as they evolve. As others have said, this is incredibly important work. I recall the mid-rise guidelines evolving, I'm guessing something like 20 years ago. I remember the precedents that were put forward at the time. I'm looking at the precedents that have been put forward now, and candidly, they pale by comparison for the most part. And we're in a different world 20 years on, and we need to take stock of that. And I think this panel has a whole bunch of volunteers with incredible experience and talent. And I would just suggest, and I'm guessing, I'm volunteering everybody's time here, but I'm guessing we'd all be more than happy to participate in a workshop that would start with a presentation by the architects on the panel that have developed mid-rise development and make specific suggestions in relation to the policy that's evolving. In my case, for example, I had the pleasure of working with Creatio in the City of Toronto to develop a framework for the Parkdale Hub, which included 2 substantial affordable mid-rise developments, which didn't fit the norm and had exceptional circumstances. And, you know, I'm sure everyone that we've heard from today has similar suggestions. And so I would suggest, you know, this 1.5 hour or whatever it is, design review panel session is not enough, and that we assemble again under the direction of the city and with the organization of the city to really focus on how to really improve and shape mid-rise guidelines moving forward. That's my primary suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you all for the comments. And I've been listening, observing, and I think the one of the takeaways from this, and I think people have mentioned it, and to the city, I think maybe for certain things that the city creates standards for, the process or the way you've put it together in terms of the path that you've taken might make sense, but this one does not work with that. That the things that I'm hearing are really showing that, and this may in turn lead the city to a different way in which it handles its other studies like this, resulting in guidelines, requirements. It may need to be much more enabling as opposed to ruling. And I think a lot of cities, the automatic way to do it is to dive deep and to come up with rules and guidelines. And really that, in this case, clearly doesn't help. I think picking up on what Joe was talking about, what should really happen, and many people have said it, is get the implementers in. I remember working in a design office, working on a design, and we had a contractor, and somebody said, well, why don't you just bring the contractor in now? And this was in a time when you never did that. You just never did that. And it made remarkable difference. And I think that this is certainly a situation that is extremely urgent that you get those people in. The work that you've done so far is something, you know, it's been a labor of love, and there's certainly sufficient information in here for those implementers to look at it and go, you know what, there's a simpler way to do it. And again, picking up on some of the comments from people who've been to other cities, I was in Switzerland recently, and many of the buildings were of this height. And I look at them in my mind now, and they were extremely simple. You know, everything, the structures were simple. The weight went straight down to the ground. It didn't jog. It didn't create any of those things that we're worried about here today. And yet, those buildings and those streets worked. And so, just as a lady had talked about the city of Hamilton having a precedent process, I think that's worth following. And if simplicity is in some of our favorite streets, then the simplicity is what we should be looking at. There are enough people who are creative in terms of how to handle simplicity and please the eye and avoid boredom in the urban environment. But underlying the simplicity is going to help a lot. So I think, and it sounds like I'm seeing chats coming in. Meg, your list that you have, I think it starts with us just putting this information, send it in to Leanne so we can get things started and at least give what we've done to the team. And in all honesty, this should have happened a long time ago, right at the very beginning. Not attaching any blame. It's just that now you can tell from the feedback that's come through from everybody that that's the way to go. So that's it. We don't hold any vote, but I think people have certainly made comments, and there's urgency to this. And it would be a shame to do it and not do it right, because this building type is so needed, and it needs to be doable. It needs to be buildable. Otherwise, the developers will just stay away from it. That's it.